The alarm clock shattered the darkness at 4:30 in the morning. Margaret Sullivan, who everyone called Maggie, had heard that sound every single day for 15 years. At 62 years old, most women her age were thinking about retirement, about slowing down, about finally resting after decades of work. But Maggie Sullivan didn't have that luxury. She couldn't afford to slow down. She couldn't afford to rest. She moved through the small apartment like a ghost, careful not to wake the others. Tyler, her 8-year-old grandson, needed every minute of sleep he could get. The leukemia treatments left him exhausted, and Maggie had learned to move silently through their home in these early morning hours. But this morning, someone else was already awake. Jennifer Sullivan sat at the tiny kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd brewed in the dark. 40 years old, Maggie's niece, and for the past 2 months, her roommate. Jennifer had nowhere else to go. The divorce had taken everything. The job loss had taken her dignity. Now she lived on her aunt's couch, helping with Tyler when she could, searching for work when she couldn't sleep. "You should be resting," Maggie said quietly. "You have interviews today." Jennifer looked up at her aunt, the woman who had raised her when her own mother died, the woman who was now 62 and working 3 jobs to keep a dying boy alive. "Let me make your breakfast," Jennifer said. "It's the least I can do." Maggie touched her niece's shoulder, a gentle pressure, a transfer of strength from one generation to the next. They didn't speak again. They didn't need to. 2 women, 2 generations, both carrying weight that should have been shared by many, but instead rested on just their shoulders. The hallway outside the apartment was dark. Maggie locked the door behind her with the same key she'd used for 12 years. Rent was $1,100 a month. She was never late, never once in 12 years. The building was old, the kind of place where working people lived because it was what they could afford, where single mothers raised children alone, where elderly men died quietly and no one noticed for days. Sophie Chen stood in the hallway, fumbling with her own keys. 20 years old, rail thin, wearing a uniform that was slightly too large. Her first day, her first real job. She'd been living in a studio apartment 3 doors down for 6 months, surviving on ramen and hope, sending out applications every day and hearing nothing back until Rosewood Diner finally called. The 2 women looked at each other in the dim hallway light. "Ms. Sullivan," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so nervous. I don't know if I can do this." Maggie studied the young woman, saw herself at 20, saw every young woman who'd ever been afraid and alone and trying to survive in a world that didn't make it easy. "You'll do great," Maggie said. "Remember this. You're there to serve food, not to serve them. There's a difference. You provide a service. You're not a servant. Never forget that." Sophie nodded, not quite understanding, but trusting anyway. They rode the bus together. The first bus of the day, the one that carried night shift workers home and early shift workers to their posts. The driver knew Maggie by name, had known her for 15 years. He nodded as she climbed aboard, as she took her usual seat near the back, as Sophie sat beside her. Maggie reached into her bag and pulled out a wrapped sandwich, peanut butter and jelly. She'd made 2 that morning. She offered one to Sophie without a word. "I can't," Sophie said. "That's your breakfast." "Someone did this for me once," Maggie said, pressing the sandwich into Sophie's hands. "Now you'll do it for someone else someday." The bus rumbled through streets still dark with night, past closed shops and empty parking lots, past the lives of people who would wake in 2 hours and never think about the invisible army that kept their world running. The cleaners, the cooks, the servers, the people who made sure coffee was hot and bathrooms were clean and breakfast was ready when the sun came up. In 4 hours and 23 minutes, Sophie would learn what true mentorship costs and what it's worth. But for now, she ate her sandwich and watched the city wake up and felt less alone than she had in months. Rosewood Diner sat on the corner of Highway 27 and Oak Street. Nothing special to look at. The kind of place you'd drive past without noticing, tucked into a working-class neighborhood where people came for strong coffee and affordable breakfast before heading to jobs that broke their backs and barely paid their bills. But to the people who knew it, Rosewood was more than a diner. It was community. It was family. Linda Morrison had owned the place for 23 years. 58 years old, divorced for 10, she'd built this business alone after her husband left her with nothing but debt and a broken heart. She'd scraped and fought and survived. And now Rosewood was hers. Completely hers. Every table, every chair, every crack in the linoleum floor. She was already there when Maggie arrived at 6 in the morning, 30 minutes before the shift officially started. But Maggie Sullivan had never been late, not once in 15 years. Linda looked up from the register and smiled. That tired, genuine smile that came from seeing someone you loved walk through the door. "Morning, Maggie." "Morning, Linda." They didn't need more words than that. 23 years of friendship lived in that simple exchange. Linda knew about Tyler's leukemia, knew about the 3 jobs, knew about Jennifer sleeping on the couch, knew about the medical bills that never stopped coming. And she knew she couldn't pay Maggie more, much as she wanted to. The margins were too thin. The neighborhood was too poor. The competition was too fierce. "I wish I could pay you more," Linda said quietly, the words slipping out like a confession. Maggie tied her apron, the same apron she'd worn for 15 years, her name stitched across the chest in fading red thread. "You pay me fairly," Maggie said. "I choose 3 jobs. That's not on you. For Tyler. For Tyler and Jennifer, and for me, to feel useful." Linda understood that. The fear of becoming invisible through inactivity. The terror of sitting still long enough to realize how much it hurt. Work was identity for women like them. Work was purpose. Work was the thing that kept them from thinking too hard about everything they'd lost along the way. The diner filled slowly as morning came. The regulars arrived like clockwork, each one a story, each one known by name. Maria Santos pushed through the door at 6:45, still wearing her scrubs from the night shift at County Memorial. 45 years old, single mother of 3, working double shifts to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She ordered the same thing every morning: coffee with 2 sugars, oatmeal with raisins. Her budget was tight, every dollar accounted for, every meal calculated. Maggie brought the coffee and the oatmeal, and on the plate, an extra portion of fresh fruit. Strawberries today. Maria saw it, knew Maggie did this, knew it wasn't on the menu, knew it was an act of quiet kindness that Maggie could barely afford to give. Their eyes met. Maria's filled with tears she wouldn't shed until she got home. Maggie's filled with understanding that needed no words. "Thank you," Maria whispered. Maggie just nodded and moved to the next table. Patricia Chen sat in the corner booth, alone, reading the newspaper through bifocals that kept sliding down her nose. 68 years old, widowed for 5 years, she came to Rosewood every Tuesday and Friday morning. Not for the food, for the company, for the sound of voices and the feeling of being somewhere that mattered. Maggie knew this. Sometimes, when the morning was slow, she'd sit across from Patricia for a few minutes. Just sit. Just be present. 2 older women in a world that had decided they were invisible. "You remind me of myself," Patricia said this morning, folding her newspaper. "Always taking care of everyone." "Someone has to," Maggie said. "But who takes care of you?" Maggie didn't have an answer for that. She never did. So she poured more coffee and moved on. Yolanda Harris sat at the counter, postal uniform crisp despite the early hour. 53 years old, divorced, kids grown and gone. She worked because sitting at home felt like dying. She knew Maggie's story. Everyone in this neighborhood knew everyone's story. That was how small communities worked. "You ever think about just resting?" Yolanda asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. "What would I do?" Maggie said. "Sit and wait to die?" Yolanda laughed, but it was a sad sound, because she understood, because she felt the same way. Sophie Chen stood behind the counter, watching all of this, trying to learn. Linda had paired her with Maggie for training, and Sophie was beginning to understand why. This wasn't just about taking orders and delivering food. This was about seeing people, really seeing them, learning their stories, understanding their struggles, becoming part of a community that survived on small kindnesses and quiet acts of grace. "Some customers will treat you like furniture," Maggie told her during a brief lull. "Don't let them. You're human. They're human. Remember that when they forget." "But the customer is always right," Sophie said, repeating what she'd heard somewhere. "No," Maggie said firmly. "The customer is always human. So are you. Right and wrong don't change based on who's paying the bill." Linda Morrison overheard this exchange from across the diner, smiled to herself. Maggie Sullivan was a better teacher than any management seminar Linda had ever attended. In the kitchen, Rosa Hernandez worked the line, hands moving with the practiced efficiency of 30 years cooking for other people. 42 years old, immigrant from Honduras, she sent money home every month to families she hadn't seen in a decade. Her English was limited, but Maggie had learned enough Spanish to greet her every morning. Buenos dias, Rosa, ¿cómo estás? Rosa smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired face. Bien, Maggie, gracias. Small moments, small kindnesses, the invisible threads that held communities together when everything else tried to tear them apart. At 7:45, the rumble of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot. 10 Harley-Davidsons pulled in, their riders dismounting with the practiced ease of people who'd spent thousands of miles in the saddle. They wore leather vests bearing the unmistakable patches of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Some of the customers tensed. Old prejudices died hard. Bikers meant trouble. Bikers meant violence. Bikers meant danger. But 4 of the 10 riders were women. And when they removed their helmets, long hair fell free, and the tension in the diner shifted to curiosity. Diana Cruz walked in first. 42 years old, road captain, former ER nurse who'd quit 3 years ago after watching a patient die and knowing she could have prevented it if she'd only been braver. She'd been running ever since, running from the guilt, running from the grief, running from her daughter Lucia, who was 19 now and barely spoke to her. Diana scanned the diner with practiced eyes, old habits from emergency room triage. Who was hurt? Who was vulnerable? Who needed help? Her eyes landed on Maggie, 62 years old, moving between tables with the careful precision of someone whose feet hurt and whose back ached but who kept moving anyway. 3 jobs. Diana had overheard the conversation with Sophie. 3 jobs to keep a sick child alive. Diana knew that exhaustion, had seen it in the mirror for 15 years before she quit. Before she ran, she looks exhausted, Diana said quietly to Angela Reyes, who walked beside her. Angela Reyes, 48, sergeant at arms, saw it too. 3 jobs. How do you survive that? You don't, Diana said. You just keep moving until you can't anymore. Behind them, Rosa Martinez entered. 51, treasurer, Latina, proud. She heard Spanish from the kitchen and smiled. Her people were everywhere, working the invisible jobs that kept America running. Carmen Lopez came last of the women. 39, road safety officer, the youngest of the female angels. She saw Sophie behind the counter, nervous and new, and recognized herself 10 years ago. Scared, alone, trying to figure out how to survive in a world that didn't care if you made it or not. The 6 male angels followed. Marcus Rivera, everyone called him Mac, 54, chapter president, former Marine who'd seen combat in Iraq and came home knowing that real battles were fought in communities, not countries. Jake Thompson, known as Hammer, 49, vice president, who owned an auto shop and gave second chances to ex-cons who needed work. Tommy White, called Ghost, 46, recovering alcoholic 8 years sober. Dion Jackson, 44, high school history teacher. Pete Kowalski, 43, IT consultant. Mike Donovan, called Preacher, 50, former priest who'd lost his faith, but not his compassion. 10 people, 6 men, 4 women, all of them carrying their own wounds, all of them looking for something, purpose, redemption, community. Angela Reyes approached the counter where Maggie stood. Ma'am, table for 10? Maggie looked up, made eye contact. Angela noticed that. Most people didn't make eye contact with bikers. Most people looked away, uncomfortable, afraid. But Maggie Sullivan had been invisible her whole life. She knew what it felt like to be judged by appearance. So she looked at Angela and saw a woman, just a woman, wearing leather instead of an apron, but a woman nonetheless. Booth 7 is open, Maggie said. I'll be right over with menus. The angels moved to booth 7, the largest booth in the diner, tucked in the back corner. They chose it deliberately, closest to the kitchen. Less walking for a 62-year-old woman whose feet were already hurting at 8 in the morning. Small kindness, they noticed things like that. Carmen caught Sophie's eye and smiled. First day? Sophie nodded, surprised that this woman in leather and patches had noticed, had cared enough to ask. You'll do great, Carmen said. We all start somewhere. Sophie felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the armor of fear she'd been wearing. These people were kind. these supposedly dangerous bikers were kind. At 8:15, a black Bentley pulled into the parking lot. It parked diagonally across two handicapped spaces, the driver apparently unconcerned with the blue-painted lines or the signs clearly marking them as reserved. From her position behind the counter, Maggie noticed, saw the illegal parking, saw the arrogance of it, said nothing. People like her didn't say anything to people who drove cars like that. But Marcus Rivera noticed too, saw the handicapped spaces, saw the disrespect. His jaw tightened. "Want me to go say something?" Hammer asked quietly. "Not our business," Mac said. Yet. The door opened and Charles Hartwell stepped out. 48 years old, wearing a suit that cost $6,000, a watch that cost more than Maggie's car. Real estate developer. $340 million net worth. Every cent of it extracted from someone else's misery. Every woman in the diner felt his presence. Not attraction, danger. The predatory energy of a powerful man who'd never been told no. Who'd never faced real consequences. Who'd learned that money bought immunity from basic human decency. Linda Morrison's fingers gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles white, calculating. Can I refuse service? Will I lose business? What will it cost me to stand up? She hated herself for hesitating. Maria Santos, the nurse, reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered over 911. Ready, waiting, hoping she wouldn't need to dial but preparing anyway. Patricia Chen, 68 years old, felt her heart rate spike. She'd been treated like this in her youth, knew the type, the entitled man who saw women as objects, as servants, as less than human. Yolanda Harris, former union rep, knew she should stand up, knew she should say something, but also knew that powerful men always won. Always. Sophie Chen, 20 years old, first day on the job, felt her stomach drop. Something bad was coming. She could feel it, the way animals sense earthquakes before they hit. And Maggie Sullivan, 62 years old, 15 years at this diner, 3 jobs, 1 dying grandson, took a breath and walked toward the table where Charles Hartwell sat, phone already pressed to his ear, already talking too loudly about business that didn't concern anyone, but made sure everyone heard. She carried menus, carried water glasses, carried the weight of every invisible woman who'd ever served a meal, and been treated like furniture. "Good morning," Maggie said. "Can I start you with coffee?" Hartwell didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her existence, kept talking on his phone about evictions, about displacement, about 200 families who were obstacles to his profit margin. The angels heard this. Dion Jackson, the history teacher, leaned toward Mac. "Riverside," he whispered. "That's the Riverside Eviction Project. My friend's family lives there." Mac's expression didn't change, but his eyes went cold. Hammer's fists clenched under the table. Diana watched Maggie, watched the older woman stand there, patient, waiting, invisible. Saw herself 15 years ago, standing at a patient's bedside, waiting, watching. Not speaking up when she should have. Not this time, Diana thought. If this goes bad, not this time. Hartwell finally looked up. Not at Maggie's face, never at her face, at her name tag. "Coffee," he said. 1 word. Not a request. A command. Black. Hot. No. Maggie nodded. "Yes, sir. Right away." She poured the coffee carefully, professionally, the way she'd poured thousands of cups over 15 years. Fresh pot. Actually hot. Steam rising from the cup. Everything he'd asked for. Hartwell took 1 sip. His face twisted in disgust. He slammed the cup down hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim onto the white tablecloth. "Lukewarm garbage," he said loudly. "Enough for the whole diner to hear. Undrinkable. Are you incompetent or just lazy?" Sophie, watching from behind the counter, felt tears spring to her eyes. First day and she was already witnessing this, already learning that Maggie had been right. Some customers treated you like furniture, like you weren't human. Linda Morrison started to move forward, started to intervene, but hesitated. 1 second of hesitation. 1 second of calculating cost versus conscience. She would regret that hesitation for the rest of her life. Maggie kept her voice calm, professional, the way she'd been trained, the way she'd survived for 15 years. "I apologize, sir. I'll brew a fresh pot right away." She took the cup back to the kitchen, brewed new coffee, waited for it to finish, tested the temperature herself. It was hot. It was fine. It was the same as the last pot. But she brought it back anyway. placed it in front of Hartwell with the same careful precision, the same invisible service. He tasted it again, made a show of swirling it in his mouth like he was sampling wine. "Same temperature," he announced. "Same garbage. Are you deliberately trying to serve me substandard coffee, or are you just incompetent?" His voice carried across the diner. Performing now, making sure everyone witnessed this humiliation, making sure the 62-year-old woman understood her place in his world. Maggie felt something crack inside her chest. Not anger, not indignation, something deeper. The accumulated weight of 62 years of being invisible, of being told she didn't matter, of working 3 jobs and still not being enough. "Sir," she said quietly, "I'm happy to brew another pot if you'd like, or perhaps tea instead." She was giving him an out, a way to de-escalate, a path toward basic human decency. Charles Hartwell stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he drew himself to his full height and looked down at Maggie Sullivan like she was something he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, voice dripping with contempt. Every person in the diner went still, waiting, knowing what came next but hoping they were wrong. "I could buy this entire diner and everyone in it, including you." The threat hung in the air, ugly and raw and true, because he could, because money gave him that power, because the system was built to protect men like him and grind down women like her. And then Charles Hartwell said the words that sealed everything that came after. "Maybe if you'd gotten an education instead of settling for serving coffee your whole pathetic life, you'd understand quality when you saw it. But people like you, you're meant to serve people like me. That's just how the world works." The diner went completely silent. Not the normal quiet of people eating breakfast. The terrible silence of collective shock. Maggie's face changed. Not anger, not indignation, pain. Deep, bone-level pain. Because she'd heard insults before, had dealt with rude customers for 15 years. But something about this particular cruelty cut through every defense she'd built. This man didn't just think he was better than her. He thought her entire life, her entire existence, was worthless. She turned to walk away, going to take the high road, going to maintain her dignity, going to let this hateful man sit with his lukewarm coffee and his cold heart. She made it 2 steps. That's when Charles Hartwell picked up the cup of coffee and threw it directly into her face. The sound Maggie made wasn't a scream exactly. It was something more primal than that. A cry of pure shock and pain as scalding hot coffee hit her face, her neck, her shoulder. 185 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to blister skin on contact. Hot enough to cause permanent damage. Her hands flew up instinctively, but too late. She stumbled backward, her legs giving out not from the impact, but from the shock, the complete violation of it. Coffee dripped from her hair, ran down her uniform, pooled on the floor around her feet. And Charles Hartwell laughed. He actually laughed, a genuine sound of amusement, as if he'd just witnessed the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "Look at her," he said to his assistant, who sat frozen in mortified silence. "That's what happens when incompetent people don't know their place." Sophie Chen screamed, a high, piercing sound of horror and disbelief. Her hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. First day, and she was watching this. Watching a woman she'd just met be assaulted, be humiliated, be destroyed. Linda Morrison moved then, finally. Too late, but moving. She ran from behind the counter, dropping to her knees beside Maggie, who had collapsed against the wall, hands pressed to her face, coffee still dripping. "I'm calling the police," Linda said, voice shaking. "I'm calling right now." Maria Santos, the nurse, was already moving. Training kicked in. She knelt on Maggie's other side, gently trying to pull Maggie's hands away from her face to assess the damage. "Let me see," Maria said softly. "I'm a nurse. Let me see." Patricia Chen fumbled for her phone with trembling hands, dialed her daughter. Sarah, something terrible just happened. A man just threw coffee in a woman's face. At my diner. Get here." Yolanda Harris stood frozen, one hand gripping the counter, watching her worst fears confirmed. Powerful men did whatever they wanted, and people like her, people like Maggie, just had to take it. Charles Hartwell straightened his tie, pulled out his wallet, extracted a $100 bill, and tossed it onto the table like he was leaving a tip. "That should cover the coffee and the floor show," he announced to no one in particular. Then he turned toward the door, ready to walk out. ready to go about his day as if nothing of consequence had just happened, as if he hadn't just permanently scarred a woman's face, as if assault was just another Tuesday morning. For exactly 4 seconds, nobody moved. 4 seconds of absolute shock. Because what do you do when you witness something so cruel, so calculated, that your brain simply cannot process it? But in booth 7, 10 people didn't freeze at all. Diana Cruz was already moving before her brain registered the decision. ER nurse instincts, years of triage, years of seeing trauma and responding. She was on her feet, crossing the diner, dropping to her knees beside Maria. "I'm a nurse too," Diana said. "How bad?" Maria pulled Maggie's hands gently away from her face, and both women sucked in sharp breaths. "Second-degree burns across the right cheek, jaw, and neck," Maria said, voice shaking. "Third-degree on the cheekbone and collarbone. She needs a hospital. Now." Angela Reyes didn't wait for orders. She stepped into Charles Hartwell's path. 48 years old, 140 pounds. But she stood like a wall, like an immovable object. Her voice was quiet, but carried across the entire diner. "You're not leaving." Hartwell stopped, looked at this woman in leather and patches, sneered. "Excuse me, do you know who I am?" Angela looked him in the eye, didn't blink, didn't back down. "You're a man who just assaulted a woman, and you're not leaving until the police get here." Rosa Martinez was already on her phone speaking rapid Spanish, calling 911, calling for help, calling for justice. Carmen Lopez moved to Sophie, who had collapsed against the counter, sobbing. Carmen wrapped her arms around the younger woman, held her tight. "You're okay," Carmen whispered. "We've got you. We've got her. I promise." And then Marcus Rivera stood up. When Max stood, the other 5 male angels rose with him. Not choreographed, not planned. Just the instinct of brothers who'd ridden together long enough to move as one. They didn't run at Hartwell, didn't shout, didn't threaten. They simply walked with purpose, with absolute certainty, forming a semicircle around him that blocked any path to the door. Mac was in the center, Hammer to his right, Tommy to his left. The others filled in the gaps. A wall of leather and muscle and quiet, simmering rage. Mac's voice when he spoke wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Every person in that diner heard him clearly. "Sit down." 2 words. No question mark. No request. A statement of fact. What was about to happen would happen with Charles Hartwell sitting in that chair. Whether he chose to sit or whether he needed help sitting, the choice was his. Hartwell's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession. Confusion first, then indignation, then the beginning of real fear, quickly masked by false bravado. "Excuse me," he said, voice climbing an octave. "Do you know who I am? I'll have you arrested for intimidation. This is assault. I have witnesses." His hand moved toward his phone, toward the illusion of power and control he'd always been able to summon with a call to his lawyers. But Mac just looked at him, steady, calm. The look of a man who'd faced down enemy combatants in Iraq and wasn't remotely intimidated by a bully in an expensive suit. "You just threw scalding coffee in a woman's face," Max said quietly. "We're witnesses to that. Now sit down and wait for the police." Behind them, Diana and Maria worked on Maggie. Gentle hands, professional assessment. Both women had seen burns before. Both knew how serious this was. "She's in shock," Maria said. "Breathing is elevated. We need ice, clean towels, and we need to keep her calm." Linda Morrison was already moving, grabbing ice from behind the counter, grabbing clean towels from the kitchen. Her hands shook, but she moved. Finally. Too late to prevent it, but moving now. Rosa Hernandez, the line cook, appeared with a first aid kit, handed it to Diana without a word. Their eyes met. 2 women who didn't speak the same language, but understood each other perfectly. Sophie Chen knelt beside them, still crying but trying to help. "What can I do? What do you need?" "Stay with her," Diana said. "Hold her hand. Let her know she's not alone." Sophie took Maggie's hand, squeezed gently. And Maggie, through the pain and shock and humiliation, squeezed back. Charles Hartwell tried to move toward the door one more time. Tried to simply push past as if his expensive suit and his net worth were armor that would let him walk through walls. Hammer stepped into his path. 6'4", 240 pounds, immovable. Hartwell stopped so abruptly he nearly stumbled. The diner had become the tableau. 10 bikers surrounding one man. 2 nurses treating one victim. One owner finally standing up. One young woman learning what courage costs. One community, invisible until this moment, suddenly very visible indeed. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer, coming to a small diner on Highway 27, where something terrible had happened, but also where something else had happened, something unexpected, something that would ripple far beyond this Tuesday morning. 10 strangers had decided they would not look away, had decided that cruelty would not go unanswered, had decided that one woman's dignity mattered more than avoiding conflict. In 4 hours and 23 minutes, Sophie had learned what mentorship costs. She'd learned that it costs everything, that it costs your face and your skin and your sense of safety in the world. But she'd also learned what it's worth. It's worth 10 people who stand up. It's worth a community that refuses to accept cruelty as normal. It's worth knowing you're not alone. Maggie Sullivan had been invisible for 62 years. She'd served thousands of meals, had smiled at thousands of customers, had been kind when life gave her every reason to be bitter, had worked 3 jobs and raised a dying child and supported a broken niece, and never, not once, asked for anything in return. And then a man threw coffee in her face and laughed. But 10 people saw her, really saw her, not as a waitress, not as a servant, as a person who mattered. As a grandmother fighting to keep a child alive, as a woman who'd worked her whole life and deserved basic dignity. They saw her, and they stood. The ambulance arrived first, then police. Paramedics rushed in with equipment, but Diana and Maria had already stabilized Maggie, had already provided first aid, had already made sure she was breathing, conscious, cared for. Sergeant Lisa Martinez walked through the door, hand near her weapon, expecting chaos. Instead, she found an eerily calm scene. A woman being treated by 2 nurses. A man in an expensive suit surrounded by bikers who weren't touching him but weren't letting him leave. A diner full of witnesses, all holding phones, all with the same story. Mac approached the sergeant with his hands visible, body language open and non-threatening. "Sergeant, my name is Marcus Rivera. The victim is Margaret Sullivan. The assailant is Charles Hartwell." He threw scalding coffee in her face during an argument. "We have 6 videos from different angles and 15 eyewitnesses. We detained him but haven't touched him. He's all yours." Martinez looked at the scene, at the bikers, at the victim, at the man in the expensive suit whose face was red with rage and fear. "You're telling me you witnessed an assault and didn't retaliate?" she asked Mac. "We're law-abiding citizens, Sergeant," Mac said. "We called you. That's what you're supposed to do." Diana looked up from where she knelt beside Maggie, made eye contact with Sergeant Martinez. "I'm a former ER nurse," Diana said. "This woman has 2nd and 3rd degree burns. She needs immediate hospital transport. Everything else can wait." Martinez nodded, keyed her radio. "We need that bus now. Burn victim, serious condition." The paramedics loaded Maggie onto a gurney. She was conscious but in shock, eyes unfocused, still not quite believing what had happened. "Tyler." She kept whispering his name. "Tyler, my grandson, Tyler." Diana climbed into the ambulance without asking permission. The paramedics started to protest, but Diana showed them her nursing credentials, explained she'd been first on scene providing care. "I'm riding with her," Diana said. "She's not going through this alone." The ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, and suddenly the diner felt very quiet. Just the sound of Sergeant Martinez reading Charles Hartwell his rights. Just the sound of handcuffs clicking around wrists that had never been restrained before. Just the sound of justice, delayed but arriving, for a woman who'd been invisible her whole life. And in booth 7, 9 angels sat back down. One was gone, riding with Maggie to the hospital. But 9 remained. Witnesses, protectors, people who'd chosen to stand when standing mattered. Sophie Chen stood at the counter, still crying, but different now, not from fear, from something else. From the realization that the world could be cruel, but people could be kind. That power came in unexpected forms. That leather jackets and motorcycle patches could hide the biggest hearts. Linda Morrison locked the front door, flipped the sign to closed, sat down at the counter and put her head in her hands and cried for the first time in 10 years. Cried for waiting those 4 seconds. Cried for hesitating. Cried for every time she'd seen wrong and chosen safety over courage, but also cried because her diner, her small corner of the world, had just proven that good people still existed. That evil didn't always win, That sometimes, when it mattered most, strangers became family. Maria Santos and Patricia Chen sat together, hands clasped. Two women who'd been strangers an hour ago but were sisters now, united by trauma, united by witness, united by the knowledge that they'd seen something that would change them forever. And Rosa Hernandez stood in the kitchen doorway, watching it all, and whispered a prayer in Spanish, a prayer of thanks, a prayer of protection, a prayer for the woman in the ambulance and the people who'd stood up for her. Margaret Sullivan had been invisible for 62 years, but on this Tuesday morning, in a small diner on Highway 27, she became the most visible woman in America, and 10 strangers, who'd only stopped for breakfast, became the people who proved that money can't buy immunity, that cruelty has consequences, that dignity matters more than dollars. They became angels, not because they wore patches that said so, but because they saw a woman who needed help, and they didn't look away. In 4 hours and 23 minutes, Sophie Chen had learned what mentorship costs and what it's worth. She'd learned that sometimes it costs everything, and sometimes that's exactly the price that needs to be paid. The diner was quiet now, the coffee cold, the breakfast uneaten, but something had happened here, something that couldn't be undone, couldn't be erased, couldn't be bought or silenced or forgotten. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom, not in a corporate settlement, but in the moment 10 people stood up and said no, enough, not here, not today, not to her. And that was how revolutions began. Not with grand speeches or political movements, but with small acts of courage, with ordinary people who decided that ordinary cruelty was unacceptable. Margaret Sullivan, invisible for 62 years, had finally been seen, and the people who saw her refused to look away. That changed everything. Sarah Chen's phone buzzed against the polished mahogany of her desk. She was in the middle of reviewing discovery documents for Hartwell's latest case, a landlord threatening to sue a tenant advocacy group for defamation. The tenant group was right, Hartwell was wrong, and Sarah was being paid $450,000 a year to make sure wrong won. She almost didn't answer, almost let it go to voicemail, but it was her mother. Patricia never called during business hours unless something was urgent. "Mom, I'm in a meeting in 10 minutes. Can this wait?" Her mother's voice came through the line, shaking, breathless, terrified in a way Sarah had never heard before. "Sarah, you need to come to Rosewood Diner right now." A man just threw coffee in a woman's face. Scalding coffee. She's hurt. She's badly hurt. And he just laughed. Sarah's hand froze on the pen she'd been holding. "What?" "The man who did it. He's wearing an expensive suit. He looks like your clients. He acts like your clients." "Sarah, I watched it happen, and I didn't do anything, I just sat there. I'm 68 years old, and I just sat there while a man assaulted a woman, and I didn't move." Patricia Chen was crying now, full sobs. Her daughter could hear the guilt, the shame, the desperate need for someone to tell her it wasn't her fault. Mom, listen to me. Are you safe? Is the man still there?" "The police are here. The ambulance just left. But Sarah, you need to see this. You need to see what men like the ones you defend actually do. You need to see it." Sarah closed her laptop, picked up her phone. Her hands were trembling, and she didn't know why. "I'm coming." She grabbed her coat, told her assistant to cancel her meetings, and walked out of the firm's glass tower into the Tuesday morning sun. 20 minutes to Rosewood Diner. 20 minutes to drive from the world where she defended wealthy men to the world where her mother ate breakfast and watched violence happen. 20 minutes to face something she'd been running from for 5 years. The parking lot of Rosewood Diner was chaos. 2 police cars, an ambulance pulling away, sirens wailing, a crowd of people standing outside, some crying, some on their phones, all talking at once. And in the center of it all, a man in handcuffs being led to a squad car. Charles Hartwell, Sarah's client. She knew him, had met with him 3 times in the past month, had reviewed his legal strategy, had prepared his defense against harassment allegations from a former employee, had done exactly what she'd been hired to do: make problems go away, make accusations disappear, make sure rich men never faced real consequences. Sarah parked her car and sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the diner's window, she could see her mother sitting at a table, head in hands, shoulders shaking. Could see other women gathered around her, strangers comforting strangers, a community of witnesses trying to process what they'd seen. She got out of the car and walked toward the diner on legs that didn't feel entirely solid. A police officer stopped her at the door. "Sorry, ma'am, crime scene, no entry." "My mother is inside, Patricia Chen. She called me." The officer looked at her expensive suit, her designer bag, her $300 shoes, looked at her the way working people look at corporate lawyers, with distrust, with resentment, with the knowledge that people like Sarah existed to protect people like the man now sitting in the back of a police car. "Make it quick," the officer said. Sarah pushed through the door. The diner smelled like coffee and fear. Linda Morrison stood behind the counter, phone pressed to her ear, talking to someone about insurance, about liability, about whether her business would survive this. Sophie Chen sat at the counter, still crying. A woman in leather, patches on her vest identifying her as a Hell's Angel, had her arm around Sophie's shoulders, whispering things Sarah couldn't hear but could imagine. "You're okay. You're safe, it's over." And there was her mother, Patricia Chen, 68 years old, widow, the strongest woman Sarah had ever known, sitting at a table with 3 other women, all of them holding hands, all of them crying. "Mom." Patricia looked up, saw her daughter, stood and crossed the space between them in seconds, pulled Sarah into a hug so tight it hurt. "I should have done something," Patricia whispered into her daughter's shoulder. "I should have stood up. I should have stopped it, but I just sat there. I'm so ashamed." Sarah held her mother and felt something crack open inside her chest. The armor she'd built over 5 years, the justification she'd constructed, the lies she'd told herself about why her work mattered, why defending bad men was just part of the job, why she couldn't afford to have a conscience when she had law school debt and a mother to support. All of it cracked, right there in a diner that smelled like coffee and trauma. "Tell me what happened," Sarah said. Over the next 30 minutes, as police interviewed witnesses and took statements, Sarah Chen learned exactly what kind of man Charles Hartwell was. Not from legal briefs or sanitized HR complaints, but from women who'd witnessed cruelty in its rawest form. Linda Morrison described how Hartwell had verbally abused Maggie, how he'd called her worthless, how he'd treated her like she was less than human. All over coffee that was perfectly fine but gave him an excuse to exercise power. Sophie Chen, barely 20 years old, described watching her mentor collapse, watching burns form on skin in real time, watching a woman she'd just met that morning learn that kindness didn't protect you from cruelty. Maria Santos, the nurse, described the medical assessment: 2nd-degree burns, 3rd degree in 2 places, permanent scarring, pain that would last months, trauma that would last a lifetime. And Patricia Chen described the moment that haunted her, the moment when Hartwell threw the coffee and laughed, the sound of his laughter while a woman screamed, the casual cruelty of it, the performance of it, the message it sent to every person in that diner. "You don't matter, your pain is entertainment, and I will never face consequences." Sarah listened to all of it, took notes out of habit, asked clarifying questions like the lawyer she was, and felt everything she'd been trying not to feel for 5 years come rushing back. She'd been that woman once, not serving coffee, but trapped, powerless, assaulted by a man who knew he'd never be held accountable. And she'd taken money to stay quiet, had signed an NDA, had let him win because fighting felt impossible. Now she defended men like him, made their problems disappear, helped them win over and over again. "Mom," Sarah said quietly. "What was the victim's name?" "Margaret Sullivan. Everyone calls her Maggie. She works 3 jobs, raising her grandson who has leukemia. She's the kindest person I know." Sarah pulled out her phone, pulled up Hartwell's file, scrolled through the communications, found the email from 2 weeks ago. Sullivan matter resolved, NDA signed, payment processed, no further action required. Sullivan, same last name, but that case had involved a male employee, James Sullivan, disabled veteran, fired after asking for wheelchair accommodations, had threatened to sue. Hartwell's legal team, Sarah's team, had buried him in paperwork and offered $20,000 to go away quietly. "Is there a James Sullivan related to Maggie?" Sarah asked. Patricia thought for a moment. "I don't know. Why?" "'Cause 2 weeks ago we settled a case with a James Sullivan, disability discrimination. Your friend Maggie might have a family member who was also victimized by the same man. The pieces were falling into place now. a pattern emerging from the sanitized legal language Sarah dealt with every day. Hartwell didn't just assault Maggie Sullivan. He systematically destroyed people. And he had a team of lawyers making sure none of it stuck. Sarah had been part of that team, was still part of that team. Her name was on those settlement agreements. Her signature was on those NDAs. She walked outside, needed air, needed space to think. In the parking lot, she saw them. 10 motorcycles parked in a row. The Hells Angels who'd intervened, who'd stopped Hartwell from walking away, who'd done what Sarah's mother hadn't been able to do, what Linda Morrison had hesitated to do, what an entire diner full of people had been too shocked to do. They'd stood up, immediately, without hesitation, without calculating the cost. A woman stood beside one of the motorcycles talking on her phone. Diana Cruz. Sarah had heard the other women mention her name, former nurse, currently riding in the ambulance with Maggie. Except she wasn't in the ambulance anymore. She was here, which meant she'd left the hospital, which meant something had happened. Diana ended her call and saw Sarah watching. Their eyes met across the parking lot. Two women who didn't know each other but recognized something familiar, the weight of having seen too much, of carrying guilt that wouldn't let go. "You're Patricia's daughter," Diana said, the lawyer. It wasn't a question. It was an identification, almost an accusation. "Sarah Chen, yes, I'm a lawyer." Diana walked toward her, 42 years old, wearing leather and denim, hair pulled back in a braid. She moved like someone who'd spent years in emergency rooms, efficient, purposeful, missing nothing. "Your client just permanently scarred a woman's face," Diana said. No preamble, no softening, just the truth, delivered like a diagnosis. "I know. Are you here to make it go away? Is that why corporate lawyers show up at crime scenes? To start the damage control?" Sarah felt the question like a physical blow. Because yes, that's exactly what she did. That's exactly who she was. The person who showed up and made problems disappear, who turned assault into settlement, who transformed justice into paperwork. "No," Sarah heard herself say. "I'm here because my mother called me, because she watched it happen and she's traumatized, and because I need to see what the men I defend actually do when nobody's protecting them." Diana studied her for a long moment, saw something in Sarah's face that made her expression shift slightly. Not forgiveness, but recognition. Understanding that this corporate lawyer in expensive clothes was also carrying something heavy. "The woman he hurt," Diana said quietly. "Maggie. She's at County Memorial right now. They're treating her burns. She's in shock, keeps asking about her grandson, keeps saying she can't afford to miss work, keeps apologizing for bleeding on the ambulance. She's apologizing? For bleeding, for taking up space, for being a victim. That's what 62 years of being invisible does to a person. Makes you apologize for existing." Sarah closed her eyes, saw herself 5 years ago, apologizing to the managing partner who'd cornered her, apologizing for wearing a skirt, apologizing for existing in his space, taking the money and signing the NDA, and apologizing for making him uncomfortable by reporting what he'd done. "I need to see her," Sarah said. Diana shook her head. "Family only right now, and her family is one niece and one 8-year-old boy. Then I need to help. However I can. Tell me what she needs." "What she needs is for powerful men to face consequences. Can you do that? Can you make sure your client doesn't walk away from this?" Sarah pulled out her phone, pulled up her firm's number, stared at it for a long moment. $450,000 a year. Partnership track. Her mother's medical bills paid. Security she'd never had growing up. Everything she'd worked for since law school. And all of it built on defending men like Charles Hartwell, on making their crimes disappear, on ensuring that women like Maggie Sullivan stayed invisible. She made a call, not to her firm, to someone else. "This is Sarah Chen. I need to speak with ADA Michael Torres. Tell him I have information about the Hartwell case. Tell him I'm willing to testify." Diana's eyebrows raised. "You're going to burn your own client." "I'm going to tell the truth. There's a difference." Inside the diner, Sophie Chen had finally stopped crying. Carmen Lopez, the young angel who'd stayed with her, had talked her through the panic attack, had explained what would happen next. Police reports, witness statements, possibly testimony if it went to trial. "You saw something terrible," Carmen said. "But you're not broken. You're stronger than you think." Sophie looked at this woman in leather, This biker who should have been frightening but was the gentlest person Sophie had met in months. "How do you know?" Sophie asked. "How do you know I'm strong?" "Because you're still here. You didn't run, you stayed, you witnessed. That takes strength most people don't have." I wanted to help her, Maggie, when he was being cruel, but I was too scared. "We're all scared," Carmen said. "Courage isn't not being scared. It's doing the right thing even when you're terrified." Sophie thought about that. About Maggie, who'd shared breakfast on the bus, who'd taught her about dignity and service, who'd been kind when kindness cost her everything. "I want to do something," Sophie said. "I want to help, but I don't know how." Carmen pulled out her phone, showed Sophie the video she'd recorded. 30 seconds of Charles Hartwell throwing coffee, Maggie screaming, Hartwell laughing. "This is how you help. You tell your story. You make sure people know what happened. You make sure he can't make this disappear." Sophie took the phone, watched the video, felt sick but also angry. An anger that was cleaner than fear, more useful than shame. "I'll tell anyone who'll listen," Sophie said. Across the diner, Angela Reyes sat with Linda Morrison. The diner owner had finally stopped making phone calls, had finally stopped trying to manage the crisis, had finally let herself feel what she'd been avoiding. "I hesitated," Linda said. "When he first started being cruel, I hesitated. I calculated. Will this cost me business? Will he sue me? Will I lose everything I've built?" Angela understood that calculation. Had made it herself 1,000 times. Every biker had. The moment when you decided whether to get involved or look away. Whether to risk yourself for someone else or prioritize your own safety. 4 seconds, Linda continued. I hesitated for 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, he escalated. He threw the coffee. If I'd acted sooner, maybe she wouldn't be burned right now. Angela reached across the table, took Linda's hands in her own, calloused hands from years of motorcycle maintenance, strong hands that had pulled people from wrecks and held dying friends and patched up wounded brothers. "You can't control his choices," Angela said. "You can only control yours." And after those 4 seconds, you moved. You helped, you called the police, you stood up. "But I should have been faster." Maybe, but you weren't frozen forever. That's what matters. You didn't stay silent, you didn't let him leave. You're not defined by the hesitation. You're defined by what you did after. Linda looked at this woman she'd just met, this biker who'd been eating breakfast and then became a guardian, who'd stepped between a violent man and the exit without being asked, without expecting thanks, just because it was right. "Why did you all intervene?" Linda asked. "You didn't know, Maggie. You had no obligation." Angela thought about how to answer that, about the code that held the angels together, about the thing that made them different from the stereotype people imagined. "Because we've all been powerless once," Angela said. "Every person in my club has a story about a time they needed help, and no one came. So now we come. We show up. We intervene. Because we remember what it felt like to be alone." At County Memorial Hospital, Diana Cruz sat beside Maggie Sullivan's bed. The older woman was sedated now, the worst of the pain managed by medication, but still conscious, still aware, still processing what had happened. The burns covered the right side of her face, bandaged now, dressed with specialized materials that would minimize scarring but couldn't prevent it entirely. The doctor had been honest. Permanent damage, visible scars. A daily reminder of this Tuesday morning for the rest of her life. "Your grandson is on his way," Diana said quietly. "Your niece is bringing him from school." Maggie's eyes filled with tears. "Not from pain, from something deeper. I don't want him to see me like this. He's already scared. The cancer, the treatments. He doesn't need more fear. He needs to know you're alive. That's all that matters to an 8-year-old. Maggie turned her head slightly, looking at Diana, really looking at her for the first time. "You stayed," Maggie said. "You didn't have to. You don't know me." Diana had been asking herself the same question for the past 2 hours. Why had she climbed into that ambulance? Why had she reactivated every instinct she'd been trying to suppress for 3 years? Why had she put herself back into the role of caregiver when she'd sworn she was done? "3 years ago, I watched a woman die," Diana said. "Patient came into my ER, beaten by her boyfriend. I treated her injuries, urged her to report it. She refused. I didn't push. Patient autonomy, right? Let her make her own choices." She paused. Maggie waited. 2 weeks later, she came back. Same boyfriend, same violence. Except this time he'd gone too far. She died on my table. And I knew I should have done more. Should have called the police myself. Should have violated her autonomy if it meant saving her life. Diana's voice cracked. 3 years of guilt coming out in this hospital room with a woman she'd just met. I quit nursing after that. Couldn't face another patient. Couldn't make another decision. Couldn't carry the weight of other people's lives. So I ran. Started riding motorcycles. Started moving so fast I didn't have to think. "Why are you telling me this?" Maggie asked softly. "Because when I saw that man throw coffee in your face, I saw that woman again. The one I failed. The one I let leave when I should have protected her. And this time I didn't hesitate. This time I stayed." Maggie reached out with her unbandaged hand, took Diana's hand in hers. 2 women, different generations, different lives connected by trauma and the choice to not let it define them. "You saved me," Maggie said. "You saved yourself. You survived. I just made sure you weren't alone while doing it." The door opened and Jennifer rushed in, Tyler behind her. The 8-year-old stopped in the doorway when he saw his grandmother's bandaged face, frozen, terrified. Everything Diana had seen 1,000 times in the faces of family members confronting medical trauma. "Grandma?" Maggie opened her arms. "Come here, baby." Tyler crossed the room slowly, carefully, like Maggie was made of glass and might shatter. Climbed onto the bed as gently as possible, pressed his face against her shoulder and cried. "I'm okay," Maggie whispered into his hair. "I'm okay. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Diana slipped out of the room, gave them privacy, stood in the hallway and pulled out her phone. Called her daughter for the first time in 3 weeks. Lucia answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom? Is something wrong?" "No, nothing's wrong. I just wanted to hear your voice." "You never called just to talk." "I know. I'm sorry. I've been running for a long time. I think I'm done running." Lucia was quiet for a moment. "What happened?" "I helped someone today. Someone who needed it. And it reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place. It reminded me who I used to be before I got scared." "Are you coming home?" Lucia's voice was small, hopeful, the voice of a daughter who missed her mother. "Yeah," Diana said, "I'm coming home." Back at Rosewood Diner, the police had finished their initial investigation. Sergeant Lisa Martinez had interviewed all 15 witnesses, had collected 6 different videos, had documented the scene, had arrested Charles Hartwell for assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Now she stood in the parking lot with Marcus Rivera, going over the witness statements. Mac had been a Marine, had dealt with military police, knew how investigations worked, made Martinez's job easier by organizing the Angels' testimony, making sure everyone was available, cooperating fully. "This is the cleanest crime scene I've seen in 20 years, Martinez said. 6 videos, 15 witnesses who all tell the same story. Medical documentation, clear motive and premeditation. This guy is going down." "Good," Mac said. "Your crew," Martinez continued. "They didn't touch him, didn't threaten him, just detained him until we arrived. That's not what I expected when dispatch said Hell's Angels were involved." Mac smiled slightly. "We get that a lot." "Why'd you intervene?" Martinez asked. Genuine curiosity, not suspicion. "I've seen people walk past worse." "Why'd you stop?" Mac looked back at the diner, at booth 7, where they'd been sitting when it happened. At the spot on the floor where Maggie had fallen. "Because my mother was a waitress," Mac said. "Worked 3 jobs, came home exhausted every night, and one time a customer threw a drink at her because his steak wasn't cooked right. She came home crying. I was 12 years old and I couldn't protect her." He turned back to Martinez. "I'm not 12 anymore, and I can protect people now, so I do." Martinez nodded. Understood. She'd become a cop for similar reasons. Everyone in law enforcement had a story about powerlessness, about watching injustice and feeling helpless, about deciding that next time would be different. "Hartwell's lawyer is already calling," Martinez said. "High-powered firm. They're threatening lawsuits, harassment, unlawful detention. They're going to make this ugly." "Let them try," Mac said. "We've got truth on our side, and truth beats money eventually." "I hope you're right." "Me too." Inside the diner, Sarah Chen sat with her mother and the other women. Patricia had calmed down, but the shame was still there, visible in the way she couldn't make eye contact, in the way her hands shook when she picked up her coffee cup. "Mom," Sarah said gently. "You did nothing wrong." I sat there. I watched. I didn't help. "You were in shock. That's a normal human response to trauma." "I should be better than normal," Patricia said fiercely. "I raised you to stand up, to fight, to never let powerful men get away with cruelty. And when it mattered, I froze." Sarah understood that shame, had felt it herself 5 years ago. The paralysis that came from fear, the way your body betrayed you in moments of crisis, the guilt that followed you forever. "You called me," Sarah said. "You made sure I saw this. You made sure I knew what kind of man I was defending. That's standing up. That's fighting." Patricia looked at her daughter, really looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. "Are you still going to defend him?" "No, I'm going to help convict him." "You'll lose your job." "I know. You'll lose everything you've worked for." "Not everything," Sarah said. "I'll keep my integrity. I'll keep my soul. I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror again." Patricia Chen started crying again, but different now. Pride instead of shame. Relief instead of guilt. "That's my daughter," she whispered. The diner's door opened and Emma Hartwell walked in. 16 years old, wearing her school uniform. Face pale and determined. She'd seen the news on her phone, had seen her father being arrested, had seen the video that was already going viral, and she'd made a decision. Linda Morrison looked up as the girl approached, saw something familiar in her face, the same jawline, the same eyes. This was Charles Hartwell's daughter. "I'm sorry," Linda said reflexively. "We're closed." "I know, I'm Emma Hartwell. That man they arrested is my father." The diner went quiet. Every woman turned to look at this teenager who just identified herself as the daughter of a monster. Emma's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "I need to talk to the police. I need to give a statement because this isn't the first time my father has done this before. And I've stayed silent, but I'm not staying silent anymore." Sophie Chen stood up, walked over to Emma, 2 young women, roughly the same age, standing in the wreckage of this Tuesday morning. "That takes courage," Sophie said. Emma looked at her, saw the tears still drying on Sophie's face, understood that this girl had witnessed something terrible. "You saw it happen?" "Yes." "Was she okay? The woman he hurt?" Sophie thought about how to answer that. About Maggie's screams, about the burns, about the way a kind woman had collapsed and the world had revealed itself to be cruel. "She's alive," Sophie said. "She's strong. She's going to survive." "Good," Emma said, "because I'm going to make sure my father pays for what he did to her." Sarah Chen stood up, introduced herself, explained that she was a lawyer, that she was willing to help, that she knew people at the DA's office. "Why would you help me?" Emma asked. "You're a corporate lawyer. You defend people like my father." "I used to," Sarah said. "I'm done with that. Now I want to help the people they hurt." Emma nodded, pulled out her phone, opened a video file. "I recorded this 6 months ago. My father threw a glass at our housekeeper, cut her arm. She needed 12 stitches. He paid her $10,000 to not report it. I've been too scared to show anyone." She held out the phone. Sarah took it, watched 30 seconds of Charles Hartwell's cruelty toward another woman, another victim, another crime that money had made disappear. "This is evidence," Sarah said. "This is proof of pattern. This will help convict him." "Then use it," Emma said. "I'm done protecting him. I'm done being ashamed. I'm done pretending we're a normal family." "Your mother?" Sarah asked carefully. "Does she know you're here?" "She's leaving him. Filed for divorce this morning. She knows I'm here. She supports it." Around the diner, women were watching this moment. This teenager finding her voice. This daughter choosing justice over loyalty. This girl becoming a woman right in front of them. Angela Reyes walked over, knelt down so she was eye level with Emma. "What you're doing takes more courage than most adults ever find," Angela said. "You're going to change someone's life. You're going to give a victim justice. Remember that when it gets hard." Emma nodded, blinked back tears, felt the weight of what she was doing, but also the rightness of it. Outside, more motorcycles arrived. Word had spread through the Angels network. Other chapters were coming, showing support, showing solidarity. By noon, there were 25 bikes in the parking lot. By 2 p.m., 40. They weren't there to intimidate, weren't there to threaten. They were there because one of their own had stood up, and they wanted to stand with her. Diana Cruz was their sister, and her fight was their fight. Mac organized them, explained the situation, made it clear that they were witnesses, not vigilantes, that they would cooperate with police, that they would do this the right way. But their presence sent a message to Hartwell's lawyers, to the DA, to anyone watching. This wouldn't be buried. This wouldn't disappear. This wouldn't become another settlement and NDA. This was different. At County Memorial, Tyler Sullivan sat beside his grandmother's bed, holding her hand. Jennifer had stepped out to make phone calls, to Tyler's school, to her job interviews, to the life that had been interrupted by violence. "Are you in pain?" Tyler asked. "A little. The medicine helps. What if your face doesn't get better?" Maggie looked at her grandson, 8 years old, bald from chemotherapy, fighting for his life every single day, and worried about her face. "Then I'll have scars," Maggie said. "Scars are just proof you survived something hard. You have scars. I have scars. We match now." Tyler thought about that, about the port in his chest where they put the chemo, about the needle marks on his arms, about the things cancer had done to his body. "I don't want you to hurt," he said. "I don't want you to hurt either, baby. But sometimes we hurt and we survive anyway. And that's okay." Diana Cruz stood in the doorway listening, saw the strength in the 62-year-old woman who'd been assaulted and was now comforting her grandson, who'd been burned and was teaching lessons about survival, who'd been broken and was showing how to heal. This was why she'd become a nurse, to witness this, to help this, to be part of the human resilience that defied logic and medical science and common sense. She pulled out her phone, called her supervisor at County Memorial. "This is Diana Cruz. I know I resigned 3 years ago, but I want to come back, part-time. I want to work in the free clinic. I want to help people who can't afford care." There was surprise on the other end. Questions. Diana answered them all, and by the end of the call, she had a job. Starting next week, back to nursing, back to caring, back to the work that had always been her calling. As the sun set on this Tuesday, all across the city, women were making choices, small choices, private choices, choices that would ripple outward in ways none of them could predict. Sarah Chen sent an email to her firm, resignation effective immediately, attached a statement explaining why, explaining that she could no longer defend the indefensible, that some lines couldn't be uncrossed. Sophie Chen wrote a letter to the local newspaper, to the mayor, to anyone who would listen, describing what she'd witnessed, describing how service workers were treated, demanding change. Emma Hartwell gave her statement to police, every detail, every incident, every time she'd watched her father hurt someone and stayed silent. All of it on the record now, all of it evidence. Patricia Chen called her other daughters, her friends, her community, told them what she'd witnessed, told them about the woman who'd been hurt, told them about the angels who'd helped, started organizing, started planning, started building something. Linda Morrison made a decision too, posted a sign on the door of Rosewood Diner, "In memory of what happened here today, in honor of Margaret Sullivan. This establishment will no longer tolerate abuse of service workers. Customers who are cruel will be asked to leave. Dignity is not negotiable." And across the city, in homes and offices and hospitals and schools, women talked about the video that was going viral. The video of Charles Hartwell throwing coffee, of Maggie Sullivan screaming, of 10 angels standing up. They shared it, they commented on it, they told their own stories of being invisible, of being treated like furniture, of enduring cruelty because they had no choice. But they also told stories of standing up, of fighting back, of finding their voices. The video had been viewed 2 million times by sunset, 5 million by midnight. By morning, it would be everywhere. And Charles Hartwell's face would be synonymous with everything wrong with power and privilege and entitlement. But more important than his fall was what was rising: a network, a coalition, a sisterhood of women who decided that invisible was no longer acceptable, that service work was dignified work, that cruelty would not be tolerated, that they mattered. Margaret Sullivan, 62 years old, had been invisible her whole life. But on this Tuesday evening, lying in a hospital bed with burns on her face and her grandson holding her hand, she was the most visible woman in America. And the women who saw her refused to look away. They stood up, they spoke out, they organized. They became a movement. And movements change everything. Maggie Sullivan woke in the hospital room 3 days after the assault, and for a moment didn't remember. thought she was home, thought it was a normal Wednesday morning and the alarm would sound any minute, and she'd have to get up for the early shift at Rosewood Diner. Then the pain hit. Not the sharp agony of the first day, but a deep, bone-level ache that radiated from her face down through her neck and into her chest. The burns were healing, but healing hurt worse than the initial trauma. Every breath felt like fire. Every movement of her jaw sent lightning through damaged nerve endings. She touched her face carefully, felt bandages where skin should be, felt the thickness of medical dressings covering what used to be familiar territory. Her own face had become foreign country. The mirror sat on this bedside table. The nurse had left it there yesterday, asked if Maggie wanted to see. Maggie had said no, had said not yet, had said maybe tomorrow. Tomorrow was here now. She picked up the mirror with her left hand. The right was still too stiff, the burns on her shoulder making movement difficult. Held it at arm's length, took a breath, looked. The right side of her face was unrecognizable. Angry red skin stretched tight over cheekbone. White patches where third-degree burns had destroyed tissue completely. The line of her jaw distorted by swelling. Her neck mottled with discoloration that the doctor said might fade over months or might be permanent. This was her face now. This was what Charles Hartwell had made of her. She put the mirror down very carefully, didn't cry, had cried enough over 3 days. Now she felt something different. Not sadness, not even anger, something colder, something harder. Determination. He wanted to make her invisible, wanted to destroy her for the crime of existing in his space, wanted to teach her that people like her deserved punishment for not knowing their place. Instead, he'd made her impossible to ignore. The door opened, and Diana Cruz walked in carrying coffee in a paper bag from the hospital cafeteria. 5 days since the assault, and Diana had been there every single day. Sometimes all day, sometimes just an hour, but always there. "You're looking at yourself," Diana said, not a question. An observation from someone who'd seen this moment 1,000 times in her nursing career. "Trying to. How does it feel?" Maggie thought about how to answer. About the complexity of seeing your own destruction. About the strange disconnect between the pain you felt and the damage you saw. "Like looking at a stranger," Maggie said finally. "Like someone else's trauma. That's normal. Your brain is protecting you. Eventually you'll integrate it. Eventually this face will feel like yours again." "Will it?" Diana sat down in this chair she'd occupied for hours over the past days. Set the coffee and food on the table. Made herself comfortable in the way of someone planning to stay. "I don't know," Diana said honestly. "I've seen people recover from worse. I've seen people never recover from less. Trauma doesn't follow rules. You heal at your own pace. What if I don't heal? Then you carry it. You survive anyway. You figure out how to live with scars that don't fade." Maggie looked at Diana. Really looked at her for the first time since waking up. Saw the tiredness around her eyes, the weight she carried, the scars that didn't show on skin. "What are you carrying?" Maggie asked. Diana smiled slightly, sad recognition of being seen by someone who understood. 3 years ago, I watched a patient die. Woman named Elena Rodriguez, 28 years old. Came into my ER beaten half to death by her boyfriend. I treated her, stabilized her, urged her to report him. She refused. I let her leave. Patient autonomy, her choice. Diana's hands gripped the coffee cup tighter. 2 weeks later, she came back. Same boyfriend, worse beating. She died on my table. And I knew I should have done more. Should have called police myself. Should have broken protocol. Should have saved her. You quit nursing after that. I ran away after that. Couldn't face another patient. Couldn't make another decision. Couldn't carry the weight of knowing I let someone die when I could have prevented it. Maggie reached out with her left hand, took Diana's hand in hers. 2 women holding pain between them like a shared weight that was somehow lighter when divided. "You came back for me," Maggie said. "I came back because I couldn't let another woman die. Couldn't watch another person get hurt and do nothing. 3 years of running, and it all came down to that moment in the diner. Stand up or stay silent. Help or hide. You chose to help. We all chose to help. All 10 of us. We saw you, and we couldn't look away." The door opened again, and Jennifer entered with Tyler. 8 years old, bald from chemo, eyes too big for his thin face. He'd visited every day, but still approached his grandmother's bed carefully. Still moved like she might break. "Hey, baby," Maggie said. Her voice was rough from intubation during the initial treatment, but getting stronger. Tyler climbed onto the bed, studied her face with the brutal honesty of children. Does it hurt? Yes. A lot? A lot. I'm sorry the mean man hurt you. Maggie pulled him close, breathed in the antiseptic smell of hospital mixed with the little boy scent of her grandson. I'm sorry you have to see me like this. Tyler pulled back, looked at her with an expression far too mature for 8 years old. Grandma, I have scars too. From the port, from the needles, from being sick. We match now. We're both warriors. Maggie felt something crack open in her chest. Not breaking, opening, making room for something new. Pride, strength, the resilience of a child teaching an adult how to survive. Yeah, she said, we're both warriors. Jennifer stood at the foot of the bed watching her aunt and her cousin. 40 years old, and everything in her life had fallen apart. Divorce, job loss, living on a couch, dependent on a woman who already carried too much. But watching Maggie with Tyler, seeing the strength in her aunt despite everything, Jennifer felt something shift. If Maggie could survive this, if an 8-year-old could face cancer with courage, then Jennifer could figure out her life. Aunt Maggie, Jennifer said, I got a job. Maggie looked up. What? Rosewood Diner. Linda called this morning, asked if I wanted to work there, said she needs someone she can trust, said you trained Sophie so well that she wants more people like you, like us. Jennifer's voice wavered between pride and uncertainty. I know it's not fancy, I know it's just waitressing, but it's something. It's a start. Maggie smiled. The first real smile since the assault. It hurt her face, the skin pulled tight over damaged tissue, but she smiled anyway. It's honest work, Maggie said. There's dignity in service, don't let anyone tell you different. At the district attorney's office, Sarah Chen sat across from ADA Michael Torres and laid out everything she knew about Charles Hartwell. Every settlement, every NDA, every complaint that had been buried under mountains of legal paperwork and corporate money. Torres listened and took notes. 45 years old, career prosecutor, he'd built his reputation going after powerful people who thought they were untouchable. But he'd never had an inside source like this. Never had someone from the defense team flip and bring the whole case file with them. This is enough for pattern evidence, Torres said. Shows systematic abuse, shows he's done this before, shows this wasn't an isolated incident. It's not just pattern, Sarah said, it's conspiracy. He didn't work alone. He had a whole firm making his problems disappear, including me. You're willing to testify to that? I'm willing to testify to all of it, even if it means my career is over, even if it means I never practice law again. Torres studied her, saw the guilt written in every line of her face, the weight of complicity, the desperate need for redemption. Why now? He asked. You've been doing this for years. Why flip now? Because I watched the video, watched him throw coffee in her face, watched him laugh while she screamed, and I saw myself 5 years ago. Different circumstances, but same powerlessness, same cruelty, same men who face no consequences. Sarah pulled out a folder, set it on Torres's desk. That's everything. Every case, every settlement, every victim I helped silence. I'm giving you all of it. Torres opened the folder, started reading. His expression darkened with each page. Jesus Christ, how many? 47 documented incidents over 5 years. Sexual harassment, assault, discrimination, illegal evictions, safety violations. He's hurt dozens of people and bought every single one of them off. And your firm knew? My firm facilitated. We weren't just defense lawyers, we were enablers. We were accomplices. Torres closed the folder, looked at Sarah with new respect. You know what this means for you. Bar investigation, possible charges, your mother's medical bills. I know, I'm prepared. Are you? Because once you testify, there's no going back. Hartwell's lawyers will destroy you. They'll attack your credibility, claim you're a disgruntled employee, accuse you of fabricating evidence. Let them try. I have documentation. I have recordings. I have proof. Torres nodded, picked up his phone, made a call. I need a meeting with the senior partners at Sullivan and Moore. Tell them I have evidence of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to cover up criminal activity. Tell them they have 24 hours to cooperate or I file charges. He hung up, looked at Sarah. You just started a war. Good, Sarah said. I'm tired of surrendering. Across town, in a conference room at one of the city's most expensive law firms, Charles Hartwell sat with his new legal team. He'd fired the first 3 lawyers who told him to take a plea deal. Now he had a team that promised they could make this go away. The lead attorney, Michael Thornton, 60 years old and famous for defending the indefensible, laid out the strategy. We attack the victim's credibility, question her motives, suggest she provoked you, plant doubt in every juror's mind about what really happened. There's video, Hartwell said. 6 videos, all showing the same thing. Video can be misleading, doesn't show what happened before, doesn't show context. We'll argue you were defending yourself from aggressive service. She's a 62-year-old waitress. How aggressive could she be? Thornton smiled, the predatory smile of a shark who smelled blood. That's not the question. The question is what the jury believes. And we'll make them believe you were the victim. Rich man targeted by bikers looking for a payday. Old woman who saw an opportunity. Corporate conspiracy against an honest businessman. Hartwell leaned back. Let himself believe this fiction. Let himself become the hero of his own story. What about the other allegations? The settlement Sarah Chen is giving to the DA? We'll claim she's lying, disgruntled employee, fabricating evidence. We'll get it all thrown out as inadmissible. Can you do that? We can try. And even if we can't, we can delay. Tie this up in appeals for years. By the time it goes to trial, people will have forgotten. Moved on to the next outrage. Hartwell nodded. This was the world he knew. The world where money bought time and time bought forgetfulness. Where justice could be delayed indefinitely. Where consequences were for other people. What about my daughters? Emma gave a statement to police. My own daughter testified against me. Thornton's expression hardened. We'll destroy her credibility too. Rebellious teenager, coached by her mother, seeking attention. The video she provided is inadmissible, recorded without your knowledge, illegal in this state. She's my daughter. She's a witness for the prosecution. She's the enemy now. At Emma Hartwell's school, word had spread. The video had gone viral. Emma's face wasn't in it, but her name was everywhere. Daughter of the coffee thrower, child of a monster, girl who turned against her father. Some students avoided her, uncomfortable with proximity to scandal. But others sought her out, told her she was brave, told her she did the right thing, told her their own stories of fathers who were cruel and mothers who stayed silent and children who learned to endure. One girl, Maya Rodriguez, sat with Emma at lunch, 16 years old, scholarship student, daughter of immigrants. My mom, Maya said quietly. She was the housekeeper, the one your dad threw the glass at. Emma's breath caught. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I should have said something then. I should have helped. You were 12, you were a kid. I'm not a kid anymore. No, Maya said. You're not. And you're doing what your dad should have taught you. Standing up for what's right. Emma looked at this girl she'd never noticed before. How many Mayas were there in her life? How many invisible people her father had hurt? How many victims she'd ignored because it was easier than seeing? Is your mom okay? Emma asked. She has a scar on her arm, from the glass. Says it reminds her to be careful around powerful men. Says it reminds her she survived. I want to help, Emma said. Tell me how to help. Maya pulled out her phone, showed Emma a group chat. Service Workers United. Hundreds of members. People organizing. Fighting back. Demanding protection. Sophie Chen started this, the waitress who saw what happened to Ms. Sullivan. She's organizing all over the city, getting service workers to speak up, to share their stories, to demand change. Can I help? You're already helping. Your testimony matters. Your video matters. But if you want to do more, come to the meeting tomorrow night, Community Center, 7 p.m. We're planning a march. I'll be there, Emma said. At Rosewood Diner, Sophie Chen stood on a chair in the middle of the dining room, addressing a crowd of 30 people. Servers and cooks and dishwashers from restaurants across the city. People who'd seen the video and recognized their own experiences. People who were tired of being invisible. We've all been Maggie Sullivan, Sophie said, voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. We've all had customers treat us like we're less than human. We've all swallowed insults and smiled and said thank you for tips that don't cover rent. The crowd murmured agreement, heads nodding, shared recognition of shared pain. But Maggie Sullivan got something we usually don't. She got witnesses who stood up. She got justice that's actually happening. She got visible when usually we stay invisible. Sophie held up her phone, showed the video that had 20 million views now, showed Maggie's face, showed the moment cruelty became undeniable. This is our moment. This is when we stop accepting abuse as normal. This is when we demand dignity. A man in the back spoke up. Victor Reyes, 50 years old, dishwasher at 3 different restaurants. What do you want us to do? We need our jobs. We can't afford to make trouble. I'm not asking you to quit, Sophie said. I'm asking you to organize. Safety in numbers. If one person complains, they get fired. If 100 people complain, they get heard. She pointed to Linda Morrison, who stood behind the counter listening. Linda posted new rules here. No tolerance for abuse. Customers who are cruel get kicked out. And she hasn't lost business. She's gained it. People want to eat at places that treat workers with respect. Linda nodded. It's true. We've had more customers this week than ever before. People are choosing to support us because of our policy. Sophie continued. We're organizing a march this Saturday from City Hall to the courthouse. We're going to demand protection. Legal protection. Make it a crime to assault service workers. Make penalties real. Make consequences stick. How many people? Someone asked. Right now, 300 confirmed. But with your help, we can get 1,000. The room fell quiet. 1,000 people marching for dignity, for respect, for the radical idea that all work was worthy of basic human decency. I'm in, Victor said. I'll bring my crew from the restaurant. Others echoed, I'm in. Count me in, we'll be there. Sophie felt something she'd never felt before. Power. Not the power that came from money or status or physical strength. The power that came from people choosing to stand together, choosing to be visible together. At County Memorial Hospital, Diana Cruz started her first shift back in nursing, part-time in the free clinic, treating people who couldn't afford regular care, people who fell through the cracks of the healthcare system. Her first patient was a woman in her 50s, Rosa Mendez, cleaning houses for 20 years, no insurance, hadn't seen a doctor in a decade, had a cough that wouldn't go away and was starting to cough up blood. Diana examined her with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, asked questions, listened, really listened, not just to symptoms but to stories, to the invisible labor that destroyed bodies while keeping the world clean. You have bronchitis, Diana said, probably from cleaning chemicals. You need antibiotics and you need to stop working for at least 2 weeks. I can't stop working, I have rent. If you don't stop, this will become pneumonia. Pneumonia can kill you. Rosa laughed. Bitter sound. I can't afford to be sick. I can't afford to die. But I also can't afford rent if I don't work. So I guess I work until I drop. Diana had heard versions of this conversation 1,000 times. The impossible math of poverty. The choice between health and survival. The way the system ground people down until there was nothing left. What if I told you that the clinic has a fund? Emergency assistance for people who can't work while healing. Covers basic expenses. Rent, food, medicine. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. That exists? It does now. The Margaret Sullivan Fund. Started last week. Funded by donations. Specifically for people like you. Workers who get hurt and can't afford to heal. Diana wrote the prescription. Made the referral, connected Rosa to resources, did her job. But also did more than her job. Saw the person behind the patient, honored the labor that went unseen. After Rosa left, Diana sat in the break room and called her daughter. Lucia answered on the second ring. Mom, how was your first day back? Good. Really good. I forgot how much I missed this. I'm proud of you, Lucia said. For going back, for not running anymore. Diana smiled. Felt warmth spread through her chest. Her daughter's approval. Something she'd been chasing for 3 years. I'm coming home this weekend, Diana said. Really home, not just visiting. Home to stay. Lucia was quiet for a moment, then softly. Really, I'm done running. I'm ready to be your mom again. You've always been my mom. Not the way I should have been. Not the way you deserved. But I'm gonna do better. Okay, Lucia said. Come home, Mom. That Saturday, 1,200 people gathered at City Hall. Service workers in their uniforms, cooks in their aprons, servers in their name tags, dishwashers and janitors and delivery drivers, and every person who kept the city running while remaining invisible. Sophie Chen stood on the steps with a megaphone, 20 years old and suddenly leading a movement she'd never planned. speaking to more people than she'd ever addressed in her life. My name is Sophie Chen. 6 days ago, I watched a man throw coffee in my coworker's face. I watched her scream. I watched her fall. And I did nothing because I was too scared. Her voice echoed across the plaza, carried by microphone and amplification, but also by the weight of shared truth. But I'm not scared anymore. Because I realized something. We're only powerless alone. Together, we're unstoppable. The crowd roared approval. Signs lifted higher. Margaret's warriors, dignity not optional. Service work is real work. Maggie Sullivan couldn't march, still in too much pain, still recovering, but she was there. In a wheelchair pushed by Diana, Tyler walking beside them, Jennifer on the other side, a family forged in trauma and held together by love. The crowd saw her, saw the bandages still covering half her face, saw the visible proof of what they'd all experienced in invisible ways. And they chanted her name. Maggie, Maggie, Maggie! She raised her hand. Not a wave, just acknowledgement, just presence, just the act of being seen. Sarah Chen marched too, in jeans and a t-shirt instead of her lawyer suit, carrying a sign that said, "I was complicit, no more." Her mother walked beside her, Patricia holding her daughter's hand. 2 generations of women choosing courage over comfort. Emma Hartwell marched despite her mother's fear, despite knowing her father would see this, despite understanding that family loyalty was breaking under the weight of doing what was right. Maya Rodriguez walked beside her. 2 16-year-olds, one rich, one poor, both learning what solidarity meant. The Hells Angels road escort, 40 motorcycles surrounding the march, not leading, not controlling, just protecting, making sure no one interfered, making sure the vulnerable could speak without fear. Mac Rivera rode at the front, Diana beside him. Angela and Rosa and Carmen spread throughout, visible guardians of invisible workers finding their voice. The march moved through downtown, past restaurants where workers came out to watch and cheer, past office buildings where secretaries and receptionists pressed faces against glass and raised fists in solidarity, past the courthouse where Charles Hartwell would face trial. And at the courthouse steps they stopped. Ada Torres stood waiting. He'd organized this moment, coordinated with Sophie, wanted the public testimony, wanted the pressure on the system, wanted justice to be more than backroom dealing and plea bargains. "We're here to hear from you," Torres said into his own microphone. "Everyone who's been invisible, everyone who's been hurt, everyone who's been told their pain doesn't matter. Speak. We're listening." One by one, they came forward. Maria Santos, nurse, single mother, told about being groped by a patient and having hospital administration tell her to be more careful about what she wore. Victor Reyes, dishwasher, told about being paid below minimum wage and threatened with deportation if he complained despite being a citizen. Linda Morrison, diner owner, told about health inspectors demanding bribes and permit officials making her wait months for approvals while chain restaurants got fast-tracked. Rosa Mendez, housekeeper, told about cleaning up after people who left deliberate messes and called her stupid when she didn't speak perfect English. 20 people spoke, then 30, then 50. Each story a variation on the same theme: invisibility, exploitation, cruelty accepted as normal. And then Maggie Sullivan spoke. Diana pushed her wheelchair to the microphone, helped her stand, stood beside her ready to catch her if she fell. Maggie gripped the microphone stand with both hands, looked out at over 1,000 people who'd come to march for her, for themselves, for every person who'd ever been treated like they didn't matter. "My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 62 years old. I've worked in service my whole life. And last Tuesday, a man threw coffee in my face because I didn't serve him fast enough." Her voice was rough but clear, amplified across the plaza, reaching people blocks away who'd stopped to listen. "He called me worthless, said people like me were meant to serve people like him, said my whole life was a failure because I chose service work over education." She paused, gathered strength, felt Tyler squeeze her hand. But he was wrong. Service work is real work, honest work, dignified work, and the people who do it deserve respect, deserve safety, deserve to go home without burns on their faces. The crowd was absolutely silent, listening, witnessing, honoring her words with attention. "I'm standing here because 10 strangers stood up for me, because my community refused to let cruelty win, because people I'd never met decided I mattered." She looked at Diana, at the angels, at Sophie and Sarah and Emma and all the women who'd found their voices by helping her find hers. Now I'm asking you to stand up for each other. Don't wait for the coffee to be thrown. Don't wait for someone to get hurt. Stand up now, speak up now, make invisible people visible. The applause started slow, then built, became a roar, became a force that shook the courthouse steps and echoed off buildings and announced to everyone within hearing that something had changed. The invisible were invisible no more. Torres took the microphone, looked at the crowd, looked at the cameras recording everything, looked at the political reality that 1,000 organized voters created. I hear you, he said, and I promise you this. We will prosecute Charles Hartwell to the fullest extent of the law. We will use every piece of evidence, every testimony, every video, and we will make sure he faces real consequences. He held up a document, and I'm announcing today that my office is launching an investigation into systematic abuse of service workers. Any business, any individual, anyone who thinks money buys the right to hurt people, we're coming for you. The roar that followed shook the ground. That night, the video of Maggie's speech went viral. 5 million views in 2 hours, 10 million by midnight. Her face, still bandaged, became the symbol of a movement. Her words became a rallying cry. Service work is real work, dignified work, and the people who do it deserve respect. Newspapers picked it up, television news, social media. The story wasn't just about one assault anymore. It was about decades of abuse, centuries of invisible labor, generations of people told they didn't matter. And now those people were saying they did matter, loudly, publicly, undeniably. In his mansion, Charles Hartwell watched the coverage with growing panic. His lawyers had promised they could control the narrative, make him the victim, win in the court of public opinion. But public opinion had already decided, and it had decided against him. His phone rang, Emma calling. He answered despite knowing he shouldn't. Dad, Emma said, you need to take the plea deal. You need to accept responsibility. You need to stop fighting this. I didn't do anything wrong. You threw coffee in a woman's face and laughed while she screamed. That's wrong. That's illegal. That's evil. She provoked me. No, Dad. You provoked yourself. You've been cruel for so long you don't even recognize it anymore. But I recognize it. Mom recognizes it. The whole world recognizes it. You're my daughter. You're supposed to support me. I'm your daughter, Emma said. And because I'm your daughter, I'm telling you the truth. You're wrong. What you did was wrong, and I can't support wrong just because we share blood. She hung up. Hartwell sat in his mansion surrounded by expensive furniture and expensive art, and all the trappings of wealth that were supposed to protect him from consequences. But none of it mattered. The walls were closing in. The evidence was overwhelming. The public had turned against him, and his own daughter had become his judge. In her hospital room that night, Maggie Sullivan looked in the mirror again. The same damaged face, the same scars. But something had shifted. She didn't see a victim anymore, didn't see worthlessness, didn't see a woman who'd been destroyed. She saw a survivor. She saw someone who'd spoken truth to power. She saw a grandmother who'd shown her grandson that courage was possible even when you were scared, especially when you were scared. Tyler climbed into bed beside her, careful of her injuries, gentle in the way of children who'd learned too young to be careful. Grandma, you were on TV. I know. Everyone saw you. Everyone heard you. Good, Maggie said. Maybe now they'll listen. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you too, baby. They lay together in the hospital bed, grandmother and grandson, both warriors, both survivors, both learning that scars were just proof you'd fought battles worth fighting. And outside, across the city, in homes and apartments and shelters and streets, invisible people were becoming visible, were finding their voices, were learning that silence was a choice, and they were choosing differently now. The revolution had started, not with violence, not with destruction, but with one woman standing up and saying, I matter, and 1,000 others standing up and saying, we matter too. That changed everything. The courtroom of Judge Patricia Morrison filled 2 hours before proceedings began. Every seat in the gallery taken, overflow crowd in the hallway, media cameras positioned at the back. This wasn't just a trial. This was a referendum on power and privilege, and whether either still mattered when confronted with truth. Maggie Sullivan sat in the front row behind the prosecution table. 3 weeks since the assault. The bandages were gone now, replaced by visible scars. Pink tissue stretched tight across her right cheek, discoloration running down her neck, the permanent record of one man's cruelty written on her skin for everyone to see. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing fancy, nothing expensive. The same dress she'd worn to Tyler's school events and Jennifer's graduation, and every occasion that required something better than her waitress uniform, but still within a budget that barely existed. Tyler sat beside her, 8 years old, in a button-down shirt that Jennifer had ironed that morning. His hair was starting to grow back in patches. Chemo was working. Dr. Gutierrez had used the word remission for the first time last week. Cautiously, carefully, but he'd used it. On Maggie's other side sat Diana Cruz, former nurse, current guardian angel, the woman who'd climbed into an ambulance 3 weeks ago and hadn't really left since. She wore leather still, but had traded her riding boots for dress shoes. Respectability for the courtroom, authority for the moment. Behind them, the angels filled an entire row. Mac Rivera in the center, Angela Reyes to his right, Rosa Martinez to his left, Carmen Lopez, Hammer Thompson, all 10 who'd stood up that Tuesday morning. All 10 who'd decided one woman's dignity mattered more than their own convenience. Sarah Chen sat at the prosecution table beside ADA Michael Torres, not as co-counsel. She couldn't be. She'd been on the other side too recently. Her bar license was under review. Her career was effectively over. But Torres had asked her to sit there anyway. Visible reminder of what happened when you chose truth over money. Emma Hartwell sat 3 rows back, 16 years old, her mother beside her, Lily, her 14-year-old sister, on the other side. The Hartwell women, united in their abandonment of the man who demanded their loyalty, while giving them nothing but shame. Sophie Chen sat with the service workers who'd organized. 20 of them had taken personal days to be here, to witness, to show support, to make sure the system understood they were watching. The bailiff stood. All rise. Judge Morrison enters. Everyone rose. The judge, 63 years old, 30 years on the bench, walked to her seat with the measured pace of someone who'd presided over thousands of cases and knew that this one mattered more than most. She'd seen the video. Everyone in America had seen the video. 25 million views now. But seeing evidence before trial didn't disqualify a judge. It informed her, reminded her why justice mattered, why courts existed, why the law was supposed to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. "Be seated," Judge Morrison said. The prosecution called its first witness before the defense could even mount a preliminary motion. Torres knew delay was the enemy, knew that Hartwell's lawyers would try to drag this out, file motion after motion, create confusion where there was clarity. So he moved fast. The state calls Diana Cruz. Diana stood, walked to the witness stand, was sworn in, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth, knowing that truth was the only weapon they had against money and power and expensive lawyers. Torres approached, gentle, respectful. Let the jury see that this woman in leather was also a professional, also credible, also someone worth listening to. "Ms. Cruz, what is your profession?" "I'm a former emergency room nurse, 15 years at County Memorial, currently working part-time at the free clinic." "And what is your relationship to the defendant?" "I'd never met him before the morning of March 15th. I was having breakfast at Rosewood Diner with my motorcycle club." "You're a member of the Hells Angels?" "Yes." "Some people might find that intimidating. Why should this jury trust your testimony?" Diana looked at the jury. 12 people, mix of ages and races and backgrounds, working people mostly, the kind who understood what it meant to serve others, the kind who'd been invisible themselves. "Because I took an oath as a nurse to do no harm and help those in need. That oath doesn't end when I take off my scrubs. When I saw a woman being assaulted, I helped. That's what nurses do. That's what decent people do." Torres pulled up the video on the courtroom screen. The same 30 seconds the world had seen. Hartwell throwing coffee, Maggie screaming, Hartwell laughing. "Is this what you witnessed?" "Yes." "Describe what you saw from your perspective." Diana took a breath, transported herself back to that booth, to that moment, to the choice between action and inaction. "I was sitting with my club having breakfast. I noticed Ms. Sullivan because she looked exhausted. 3 jobs. You could see it in the way she moved, in the tiredness around her eyes. Then I heard the defendant's voice, loud, cruel, calling her incompetent, worthless. She paused. The courtroom was absolutely silent. I watched him stand up, watched him pick up the coffee cup, and I knew what was about to happen. You can see violence coming if you've worked in emergency rooms long enough. There's a moment right before, a decision point, and I saw him make the decision. What decision? To hurt her, deliberately, consciously. He chose cruelty. Objection, the defense attorney said. Speculation about my client's state of mind. Overruled, Judge Morrison said. The witness is qualified to assess intent based on professional experience. Torres continued. What happened after he threw the coffee? Diana described it. The medical assessment, the burns, the severity, the permanent scarring, spoke in clinical terms that made it impossible to minimize. Second-degree burns across 15% of upper body. Third-degree burns requiring skin grafts. Trauma that would require ongoing treatment for months. And what was the defendant's reaction when he saw Ms. Sullivan's injuries? He laughed. Then he threw a $100 bill on the table and tried to leave. Torres let that sit. Laughed. That single word doing more damage than any closing argument could. The defense attorney, Michael Thornton, approached for cross-examination. 60 years old, expensive suit, practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Ms. Cruz, you said you're a member of a motorcycle gang. The Hells Angels have a reputation for violence, don't they? We're a motorcycle club, not a gang. And our reputation is complicated. Just like nursing is complicated. Just like justice is complicated. But you've been involved in altercations before, haven't you? I've broken up fights in emergency rooms, restrained violent patients, protected vulnerable people from harm. If that's what you mean by altercations, then yes. Isn't it true that you and your associates surrounded my client, prevented him from leaving, detained him against his will? We prevented a man who just committed assault from fleeing a crime scene. We called the police. We cooperated fully. We did exactly what citizens are supposed to do when they witness a crime. Thornton tried a few more angles, tried to paint the Angels as vigilantes, as bikers with an agenda, as people who'd escalated the situation. But Diana didn't break, didn't get defensive, just told the truth calmly and let the truth defend itself. The state calls Margaret Sullivan. The courtroom held its breath as Maggie stood, as she walked to the witness stand, as everyone saw the scars up close, undeniable, permanent, the physical evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away. She was sworn in, sat down, looked at Torres and nodded that she was ready. Ms. Sullivan, tell us what happened on the morning of March 15th. Maggie told her story. Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual. The routine of her morning, the 3 jobs, Tyler's medical bills, the bus ride with Sophie, arriving at the diner at 6 a.m. because she was never late, never once in 15 years. She described serving Hartwell, the first cup of coffee, his complaint, the second cup, his escalation, the verbal abuse, being called worthless, being told her entire life was a failure, being reminded that people like her were meant to serve people like him. How did that make you feel? Torres asked. Objection, the defense said. Relevance. Your Honor, Torres said. The defendant's words establish motive. They show premeditation. They prove this wasn't about coffee temperature, it was about power. Overruled. The witness may answer. Maggie looked at the jury. 12 strangers who would decide if her pain mattered, if her dignity had been worth defending. It made me feel invisible, Maggie said quietly. Like 62 years of hard work meant nothing. Like raising a child with cancer while working 3 jobs was worthless because I never went to college. Like my entire existence was a mistake. Her voice didn't break, didn't waver. She'd cried enough over 3 weeks. Now she just told the truth. And then what happened? Then he threw the coffee in my face. Described the pain. Maggie paused, tried to find words for something that transcended language, for agony that rewrote every nerve ending, for the moment when skin stopped being protection and became fuel for fire. Like burning alive, she said finally. Like every cell in my face was screaming. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe, could only feel pain so complete it erased everything else. The jury watched her. Several had tears in their eyes. One woman, a mother in her 50s, was gripping her armrest so hard her knuckles were white. Torres showed photos, medical documentation, the progression of burns from day 1 through week 3. Each image worse than words could convey. each photograph proving that this wasn't minor, wasn't exaggerated, wasn't something money could fix. Ms. Sullivan, how have these injuries affected your life? I can't work yet, the skin is still healing, can't be around heat, can't stand for long periods. I've lost 2 of my 3 jobs because I couldn't show up. The bills are piling up. Tyler's treatment continues. I don't know how I'm going to pay for any of it. She looked directly at Hartwell. First time since entering the courtroom. He looked away. But worse than the money is the mirror, Maggie continued. Every day I see what he did to me. Every day I'm reminded that a stranger decided I deserved punishment for the crime of existing in his space. That's the real damage, not the scars on my face, the ones in my head. Torres had no more questions, sat down, let her words echo in the silence. Thornton approached for cross-examination. He'd been paid a lot of money to destroy this woman's credibility, to make the jury question her, to plant doubt where there should be none. Ms. Sullivan, you've had financial troubles for years, haven't you? Yes, medical bills for my grandson. And you've looked for ways to get money, correct? I've worked 3 jobs. That's how I get money. But you've applied for assistance, government programs, charity. When you can't afford food, you apply for help. That's not a crime. Thornton smiled, the predatory expression of a shark circling. Isn't it convenient that a wealthy man happened to do something that could result in a large settlement? Isn't it possible you saw an opportunity? The courtroom erupted, spectators shouting, Judge Morrison's gavel coming down hard, order, order. Maggie didn't shout, didn't cry, just looked at Thornton with an expression that made him take a step back. You think I wanted this? You think I asked for burns on my face? You think any amount of money is worth waking up every morning and seeing this in the mirror? She gestured to her scars. I didn't want money. I wanted to do my job and go home to my grandson. That's all I've ever wanted. To work and survive and maybe give that little boy a chance at life. Your client took that away from me, not by accident, by choice. Thornton tried a few more questions, tried to imply she'd been rude, had provoked the assault, had somehow earned what happened to her. But every question made him look worse, made the jury hate him, made it clear that blaming the victim only worked when the victim wasn't in the room showing her scars. He sat down, defeated by a 62-year-old waitress who'd told the truth. The state calls Emma Hartwell. The courtroom stirred, a daughter testifying against her father. Biblical betrayal or moral courage depending on your perspective. Emma walked to the stand, 16 years old in a simple dress, hair pulled back, face pale but determined. She was sworn in, sat down, looked everywhere except at her father. Emma, Torres said gently, I know this is difficult. Take your time. Emma nodded, swallowed hard, found her voice. 6 months ago, my father threw a glass at our housekeeper, Maria Rodriguez. It shattered, cut her arm. She needed 12 stitches. I recorded it on my phone. Torres played the video. 30 seconds of Charles Hartwell's rage, the glass flying, Maria crying out, blood on white tile, and Hartwell's response, throwing money at her, telling her to clean up the mess. The jury watched, their expressions hardening with each second. Why didn't you report this when it happened? Torres asked. Because I was 12. Because he's my father. Because I was scared. Because I thought if I stayed quiet it would stop. Did it stop? Emma's voice broke. No, it got worse. He fired people for disagreeing with him, yelled at my mother, made my sister cry, created an environment where we were all terrified all the time. Why are you testifying now? Because I watched him throw coffee at Ms. Sullivan and I realized something. Silence makes me complicit. Staying quiet makes me part of the problem. I can't control what he does. But I can control whether I tell the truth about it. Emma finally looked at her father, saw him sitting beside his lawyer, saw the man who taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework, and also taught her that power meant you could hurt people without consequences. I'm testifying because someone has to say it. My father is cruel. What he did to Ms. Sullivan isn't an isolated incident, it's who he is. And I'm not going to lie about it anymore. Thornton stood for cross-examination, faced with destroying a 16-year-old girl on the witness stand. His career had prepared him for many things, but not this. Emma, your parents are going through a difficult divorce, aren't they? Yes. And you've chosen to live with your mother? Yes. Isn't it possible your testimony is influenced by that? By anger at your father? Emma looked at him steadily. I'm angry at my father for being cruel to people, for hurting Miss Sullivan, for making me ashamed of my own last name. The divorce didn't cause that. His choices did. Thornton had nothing, sat down. Emma was dismissed, walked back to her mother, who wrapped her in a hug and whispered that she was proud. The state called Sarah Chen. Sarah stood, walked to the stand, was sworn in knowing that this testimony would end any chance of returning to corporate law, would mark her forever as the lawyer who betrayed her client, who chose principle over profit. Torres asked her about the settlements, about the pattern, about 47 documented incidents over 5 years, about the systematic cover-up of Hartwell's cruelty. Sarah provided documentation, emails where Hartwell bragged about making problems disappear, voice recordings of him mocking victims, financial records showing payments to silence complaints. This wasn't just one assault, Sarah testified. This was a system. He hurt people. My firm made it go away. We were paid to ensure consequences never happened. We succeeded for 5 years. Why are you testifying now? Because I was one of those victims once. Different circumstances, different powerful man, but same outcome. I was hurt. I was silenced. I took money and signed an NDA and told myself it was practical, that I couldn't afford to fight, that this was just how the world worked. She looked at Maggie, at the visible scars, at the courage it took to be in this courtroom facing her attacker. But seeing what happened to Ms. Sullivan, I realized I was wrong. The world only works that way if we let it. If we keep choosing money over justice, silence over truth. I'm done with that. I'm done being part of the problem. The defense rested without calling witnesses. Thornton knew that putting Hartwell on the stand would be suicide. The man couldn't help himself, would say something cruel, would reveal exactly who he was. Instead, Thornton's closing argument tried to create confusion, tried to suggest that maybe the coffee wasn't as hot as claimed, that maybe Maggie had exaggerated her injuries, that maybe this was all a conspiracy by bikers and scorned employees and rebellious daughters. The jury didn't buy it. You could see it in their faces, in the way they looked at Hartwell with undisguised contempt. Torres's closing was simple. Played the video one more time, 30 seconds. Hartwell throwing coffee, Maggie screaming, Hartwell laughing. That's the case, Torres said. That's the evidence. A man chose cruelty, chose to hurt someone who'd done nothing wrong, chose to exercise power in the ugliest way possible. And then he laughed. Torres pointed at Maggie, at her scars. She has to live with what he did for the rest of her life. Every time she looks in a mirror, every time someone stares at her scars, every time she remembers that day, she carries his cruelty. He turned to the jury. Now you have to decide. Does that matter? Does her pain count? Does his wealth protect him from consequences? Or do we live in a country where justice applies to everyone? He sat down. The jury filed out. Judge Morrison called recess. The deliberation lasted 47 minutes, short by most standards. But when the evidence is overwhelming and the truth is undeniable, deliberation doesn't take long. The jury filed back in, faces serious, verdict reached. Has the jury reached a verdict? We have, Your Honor. In the case of the People versus Charles Hartwell, on the charge of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, how do you find? The forewoman stood, looked at Hartwell, looked at Maggie, looked at the judge. We find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted. Cheers from the gallery, sobs from Maggie, Tyler hugging his grandmother, Jennifer crying, Diana squeezing Maggie's hand, the angels standing in silent solidarity. Emma Hartwell cried too, not from joy, from the complicated grief of watching your father face consequences you knew he deserved but wished he'd never earned. Hartwell sat motionless, his world ending in a single word: guilty. Judge Morrison banged her gavel, restored order, set sentencing for 2 weeks. Court is adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had swelled to thousands. Service workers who'd taken the day off, supporters who'd followed the trial, media from across the country, all waiting for the verdict, all needing to know if justice was still possible. When Torres emerged with Maggie and her family, when he held up his hand and shouted guilty, the roar could be heard for blocks. Sophie Chen stood on the courthouse steps with her megaphone. 20 years old and suddenly a voice for thousands. Justice was served today, Sophie called out. Not because the system is perfect, not because the powerful always face consequences, but because this community refused to stay silent, because witnesses stood up, because a grandmother had the courage to testify. She pointed to Maggie, who stood with Diana and Jennifer and Tyler. Margaret Sullivan showed us that invisible people become visible when we refuse to look away, when we tell our stories, when we demand dignity. The crowd chanted, "Maggie, Maggie, Maggie." Maggie raised her hand. Not a wave, just acknowledgement, just presence, just a woman who'd survived and now stood in the sun watching justice happen. That night, the video of the verdict went viral. 10 million views in 3 hours. The moment when the forewoman said guilty, the moment when Hartwell's face fell, the moment when justice, delayed and complicated and imperfect, finally arrived. But more important were the other videos, the ones that didn't go as viral but mattered more. Service workers across the country recording their own stories, sharing their own experiences, finding their own voices. A waitress in Seattle, a janitor in Miami, a housekeeper in Chicago, a dishwasher in Atlanta, all telling the same story in different words. Invisible labor, visible cruelty, the choice between silence and truth. The movement had started with one assault in one diner, but it became something bigger, something that couldn't be contained or controlled or bought off with settlements and NDAs. It became a reckoning. 2 weeks later, sentencing day arrived. Maggie sat in the same seat, Tyler beside her, her family and friends and defenders filling the courtroom once again. Judge Morrison had reviewed everything, the evidence, the testimonies, the pattern of abuse documented by Sarah Chen, the victim impact statements from dozens of people Hartwell had heard over years. She looked at him with an expression that contained no sympathy, only the cold assessment of someone who'd seen too many powerful men abuse their power and face too few consequences. "Mr. Hartwell, you threw scalding coffee in a woman's face because she didn't serve you fast enough. You laughed while she screamed. You tried to walk away as if assault was your right." Judge Morrison's voice was steady, implacable, the voice of justice finally speaking. But it wasn't just this assault, it was a pattern. 47 documented incidents of you hurting people and using your wealth to make it disappear. You've been cruel with impunity for years. She paused. Let the weight of his crime settle. This court sentences you to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years probation. You will pay restitution to Margaret Sullivan in the amount of $500,000. You will pay an additional $3 million to the Margaret Sullivan Fund to help other victims of workplace violence. You will complete anger management counseling, and you will have no contact with any of your victims for the duration of your life. Hartwell's face crumbled. 18 months. It wasn't the slap on the wrist his lawyers had promised. It wasn't the probation he'd expected. It was real time, real consequences, real accountability. You hurt people because you thought you could, Judge Morrison continued, because money had always protected you, because the system had always chosen your comfort over their dignity. That ends today. She banged her gavel. Sentence imposed. Hartwell was led away in handcuffs, the second time in 3 weeks. But this time he wasn't posting bail. This time he was going to jail. Outside, Maggie stood on the courthouse steps surrounded by the people who'd stood for her. Diana and the angels, Sophie and the service workers, Sarah and Emma, and all the women who'd found their voices by helping her find hers. Torres handed her a check. $500,000. Restitution ordered by the court. Enough to pay Tyler's medical bills. Enough to cover the lost wages. Enough to rebuild what Hartwell had tried to destroy. "I don't know what to say," Maggie whispered. "Say you'll keep fighting," Torres said. "Say you'll keep being visible. Say you'll keep reminding people that dignity matters." Maggie looked at the check, at the number that represented 3 years of her salary from all 3 jobs combined. Money that would change her life. Money that came from justice rather than charity. But she also looked at the crowd, at the 1,000 people who'd shown up to witness sentencing, at the service workers wearing their uniforms with new pride, at the movement that had grown from one woman's pain into a national conversation about value and dignity and who deserves to be seen. The money would help, would change her material circumstances, would give Tyler the treatment he needed and Jennifer the stability she deserved. But the movement mattered more. The truth that invisible people had found their voices mattered more. The reality that justice was possible mattered more. "I'll keep fighting," Maggie said. "We'll all keep fighting." The crowd roared approval. The chant started again. Maggie, Maggie, Maggie. But this time other names joined it. Sophie, Sarah, Emma, Diana. All the women who'd stood up. all the voices that had refused to stay silent. The revolution wasn't over. It had just begun. But today, for this moment, they'd won. Today, the invisible had been seen. Today, the powerful had faced consequences. Today, justice had prevailed. And that changed everything. 3 years after the coffee was thrown, Maggie Sullivan's alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning. The same sound, the same time, the same darkness before dawn. Some things never changed. Some routines were too deep to break, but everything else had changed. She moved through her apartment quietly, not because she had to anymore, but because the habit of silence had become part of her. Tyler's room was empty now. He was at summer camp, 11 years old and cancer-free for 2 years and 8 months. The doctors had stopped using the word cautiously when they said remission. Now they just said it. Remission. The most beautiful word in the English language. Jennifer had her own apartment now, 2-bedroom place 3 blocks away. She'd been working at Rosewood Diner for 3 years, assistant manager for the past 18 months. She had benefits, had stability, had rebuilt a life that divorce and job loss had tried to destroy. Maggie lived alone for the first time in 8 years. The apartment felt bigger, quieter, sometimes too quiet. But she was learning that solitude wasn't the same as loneliness, that peace could feel empty until you learned to fill it with things that mattered. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror, the same mirror she'd looked into 3 years ago. The same face, but different. The scars were still there, would always be there. Pink lines across her right cheek, discoloration down her neck, the permanent record of one Tuesday morning when a stranger decided she deserved punishment. But when she looked at herself now, she didn't see a victim, didn't see worthlessness, didn't see a woman who'd been destroyed. She saw a survivor. She saw someone who'd stood up in a courtroom and told the truth. She saw a grandmother who'd shown her grandson that courage was possible. She saw a woman who'd helped start a movement that changed laws and lives, and the way an entire country thought about dignity. The scars were still there, but they told a different story now. Not about cruelty, about resilience, not about being broken, about refusing to stay broken. She got dressed, not in a waitress uniform. She didn't have to work anymore. The $500,000 from Hartwell plus the disability settlement from the county meant she was financially secure for the first time in her life. She could have retired, could have rested, could have finally stopped moving. But Maggie Sullivan had learned something over 65 years. Work wasn't just about money. It was about purpose, about community, about the dignity of being useful. So 3 mornings a week, she still went to Rosewood Diner, not to serve tables. She couldn't do that anymore. The burns on her shoulder made it difficult to carry heavy trays. The nerve damage meant she dropped things sometimes. Her body had limits now that it hadn't before. But she went anyway, to train new employees, to mentor young women like Sophie had been, to make sure the next generation understood that service work was real work, dignified work, work that deserved respect. The bus arrived at 5:15. The same bus, the same driver. Jerome was still there, still nodding hello, still knowing her by name. Some things didn't change, and Maggie was grateful for that, for the constants in a world that had shifted so dramatically. She rode alone now. Sophie didn't live in the building anymore, had her own place too. 1-bedroom apartment she could actually afford because the Service Workers Protection Act had mandated living wages and better benefits, because the movement that started with one assault had become legislation, had become real, measurable change. Rosewood Diner looked the same from the outside. Same corner location, same weathered sign, same parking lot where 10 motorcycles had once formed a wall between cruelty and consequence. But inside, everything was different. The first thing you noticed was the plaque, mounted on the wall beside booth 7. Bronze, permanent, engraved with words that told a story. On March 15th, 3 years ago, Margaret Sullivan was assaulted in this diner. 10 strangers stood up. A community refused to stay silent. Justice prevailed. This booth is dedicated to everyone who has ever been invisible, and to those who choose to see them. Booth 7 was never available for regular seating anymore. It was reserved for service workers who needed a safe place, for people escaping abuse, for anyone who needed to know they mattered. Linda Morrison stood behind the counter, 71 years old now, but still running the diner with the same fierce dedication she'd had for 26 years. She looked up when Maggie entered, smiled, the same smile, the same warmth. "Morning, Maggie. Morning, Linda. Coffee's fresh." It always is. They didn't need more words than that. 3 years of friendship built on top of 23 years before that. A foundation too solid to require constant maintenance. Sophie Chen was already there, sitting at the counter with a laptop open, reviewing schedules and inventory reports. 23 years old. Manager now, Linda had promoted her 18 months ago when Jennifer moved to assistant manager. Sophie had earned it, had proven herself not just competent, but visionary. She'd transformed the diner's culture, created clear policies about customer behavior, trained staff on how to handle abuse, built a support system where workers looked out for each other, made Rosewood Diner a model for what service work could be when dignity was non-negotiable. Beyond the diner, Sophie had become a voice, the face of the Service Workers United movement. She spoke at conferences, testified before legislative committees, organized workers across the country. 23 years old and changing the world one policy at a time. She looked up when Maggie sat down beside her, smiled. The scared girl from 3 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who'd found her power and learned to use it. "Training session at 9, Sophie said. 5 new hires. They're all nervous. Everyone's nervous on their first day. That's why you're perfect for this. You remember what nervous feels like. You remember what it means to need this job so badly you'll take abuse just to keep it." Maggie nodded, took the coffee Linda poured, looked at the young faces in the photo Sophie showed her, all of them starting the same journey she'd been on for decades, all of them deserving better than she'd gotten. "I'll teach them what you taught me," Maggie said. "Dignity isn't optional. Service isn't servitude. They're human beings doing important work." Sophie reached over and squeezed Maggie's hand. The same hand she'd held 3 years ago, when Maggie was in a hospital bed covered in burns. The same connection forged in trauma and strengthened through healing. The door opened and Diana Cruz walked in. 45 years old now, hair longer, face softer. The hardness that came from running had been replaced with something gentler. Peace, maybe. Or at least the beginning of it. She wore scrubs, not leather. She still rode her motorcycle, still went to club meetings, still considered the Angels her family. But her primary identity had shifted. She was a nurse again, full-time at County Memorial, running the emergency department's trauma unit, saving lives, doing the work she'd been called to do. More than that, she was a mother again, really a mother. Lucia had moved back home 2 years ago. Mother and daughter rebuilding what had been broken, learning to talk, learning to trust, learning that running away solved nothing, and coming home solved everything. Diana sat down at the counter beside Maggie, ordered coffee and the breakfast special. Same order she'd gotten 3 years ago when she'd been running from guilt and trying to outride grief. "How's Lucia?" Maggie asked. "Good, really good. She's applying to nursing schools, wants to follow in her mother's footsteps." Diana's voice carried pride and something else. Redemption. The knowledge that her daughter had forgiven her, had chosen to model her life after the woman Diana had become rather than the woman she'd been. "That's because you showed her it was possible to come back," Maggie said, "to make mistakes and still be worthy of love." Diana smiled, sipped her coffee, looked around the diner that had become sacred ground, where everything had changed, where she'd stopped running and started healing. The training session at 9 brought 5 young women into the diner's back room, all of them between 18 and 25. All of them nervous. All of them needing this job more than the job needed them. Maggie stood in front of them, 65 years old with visible scars and invisible strength. She didn't hide the burns, didn't cover them with makeup or turn her face away when people stared. She let them see, let them understand that working in service came with risks, but also with dignity. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she began. "I've worked in this diner for 18 years. I love this job. I love this work. I love the people I serve and the people I work with. But 3 years ago, a customer assaulted me because I didn't serve his coffee fast enough." She let that sink in. Watched the young faces process the reality that kindness didn't always protect you, that doing your job well didn't guarantee safety. He threw scalding coffee in my face, gave me 2nd and 3rd degree burns, permanent scars, 6 weeks of recovery, And he did it because he thought I was worthless, thought my work was beneath him, thought I deserved punishment. One of the girls, Maria, raised her hand. What happened to him? He went to jail, paid restitution, lost everything. But more importantly, his cruelty started a movement, changed laws, created protections for people like us, like you, made it a felony to assault service workers, made penalties real, made consequences stick. Maggie walked closer to them. Let them see her scars up close. Let them understand that survival was possible, that healing happened even when the wounds never completely closed. You're going to meet customers who treat you poorly, who are rude, who think tipping 15% makes them generous, who forget that you're human. That's part of the job. But you don't have to accept abuse. You're protected now. The law is on your side. This diner is on your side. We have policies. We have training. We have each other. She pointed to the plaque visible through the doorway. To booth 7. 10 strangers stood up for me when I needed it. You're not alone anymore. None of us are. We're a community now. We protect each other. The training lasted 2 hours. Maggie taught them everything she'd learned over 18 years. How to handle difficult customers with grace. How to set boundaries without being confrontational. How to recognize when someone had crossed from rude to dangerous. How to ask for help. But more than tactics, she taught them value. Taught them that their work mattered, that feeding people was important, that creating community was sacred, that service was noble when done with dignity and protected with rights. When the session ended, Maria stayed behind. 18 years old, scholarship student at community college, working to pay rent and tuition, and trying to survive in a city that didn't make it easy. Ms. Sullivan, can I ask you something? Of course. Do the scars still hurt? Maggie considered this question. The physical pain had faded mostly, but the emotional scars ran deeper. The way she flinched sometimes when people moved too quickly. The nightmares that still came occasionally. The hypervigilance that made crowded spaces difficult. Sometimes, Maggie said honestly, not the way they did at first, but I'm reminded of them. I see them every day, feel them when weather changes, remember them when I'm tired or stressed. Do you regret it? Coming back here? Working in the place where it happened? Never. This is my home. These are my people. I won't let what one cruel man did take away what I love. Maria nodded. Seemed to find strength in that answer. Seemed to understand that resilience wasn't about not being hurt. It was about being hurt and choosing to keep going anyway. That afternoon, Sarah Chen came to the diner for lunch. 40 years old now. Still a lawyer, but a different kind. She'd lost her corporate job 3 years ago. Lost her 6-figure salary and her partnership track and her comfortable future. But she'd gained something more valuable. Her integrity, her purpose, her soul. Chen and Associates had grown from a solo practice to a firm of 12 lawyers, all of them dedicated to helping victims of workplace abuse. They took cases that bigger firms wouldn't touch, represented people who couldn't afford representation, won battles against powerful defendants who thought money made them untouchable. Sarah had personally handled 43 cases in 3 years, won 37, lost 6. The wins changed lives. The losses taught lessons. All of it mattered. She sat in booth 7 with her mother, Patricia. 71 years old now and still coming to Rosewood every Tuesday and Friday. Still ordering the same breakfast. Still filling the space where her late husband used to sit with newspaper and conversation and the comfort of routine. How's the Rodriguez case? Patricia asked. We settled yesterday, $200,000, enough to cover her medical bills and lost wages, enough to give her time to heal. She was the housekeeper? The one Emma's father hurt? Patricia nodded, sipped her coffee, looked at her daughter with pride that needed no words. Emma called me last week, Sarah said. She wants to intern at my firm this summer, before she starts law school in the fall. Emma Hartwell, 19 years old, sophomore at Yale, double major in political science and women's studies. Planning to go to law school, planning to spend her life fighting the systems that had protected her father and hurt so many others. She testified at 16, faced her father in court and told the truth, chosen justice over family loyalty, chosen courage over comfort. That choice had defined her, shaped her, turned her into someone who understood that privilege came with responsibility. She doesn't talk to him, Sarah continued. Hartwell, Her father. She sends him one letter a year on the anniversary of the assault, reminds him of what he did, who he hurt, who he could have been if he'd chosen differently. Does he respond? Never. He's out of jail now, working some low-level job, living in a small apartment, alone. Everything he had is gone. His family, his money, his power, all of it. Patricia considered that. The justice of consequences. The reality that cruelty eventually caught up with you even if it took years. Good, Patricia said simply. Some men need to lose everything before they understand they had nothing that mattered. At 3 o'clock, the angels arrived. Not all of them. Not like 3 years ago when 40 bikes had filled the parking lot. Just the original 10. Mac and Diana and Angela and Rosa and Carmen and Hammer and Tommy and Dion and Pete and Mike. They still rode together, still met weekly, still considered themselves family. But their purpose had shifted slightly. They weren't just protecting each other anymore. They were protecting their community, being visible guardians so invisible people could feel safe. They'd expanded their charity work. The annual ride for the Margaret Sullivan Fund had become legendary. Last year, 1,200 riders from 8 states raised $1.3 million, helped 230 families facing medical bankruptcy. They sat in booth 7, the booth that had become theirs, the booth that represented everything they stood for. Mac ordered coffee, Diana ordered eggs, the rest ordered their usual, the same meals they'd been ordering for 3 years. Maggie brought the coffee herself, moved slowly, carefully. The burns on her shoulder made carrying heavy things difficult, but she managed. She always managed. She poured coffee for Mac, for Diana, for all 10 of them. The people who'd stood up when it mattered, the strangers who'd become family, the bikers who'd proven that real strength was protecting the vulnerable. Thank you, Mac said. Not for the coffee, for everything. Maggie smiled, touched his shoulder, no words needed. They understood each other, understood that what had happened 3 years ago had changed all of them, had given them purpose, had shown them who they were when tested. Tyler burst through the door at 4:15. Back from summer camp a day early, 11 years old, tall for his age, hair thick and dark. No sign of the cancer that had nearly killed him. No visible scars except the small port mark on his chest that he wore like a badge of honor. He ran to his grandmother, hugged her carefully. He'd learned to be gentle with her, learned that she was strong but also fragile, that scars healed but never completely disappeared. Grandma, I learned to swim. Really swim. Not just float, I swam across the whole lake. Maggie hugged him back, felt tears she didn't let fall. This boy had been dying 3 years ago, had been bald and weak and fighting for every day. Now he was swimming across lakes and running and living. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Tyler saw the angels in booth 7, ran over to them. He knew them all by name, knew their bikes, knew their stories. They were his uncles and aunts, his extended family, the people who'd saved his grandmother and funded his treatment and given him a future. Uncle Mac, did you bring the pictures from the ride? Mac pulled out his phone, showed Tyler photos from last month's charity event. 1,200 motorcycles, thousands of people. All there because of what happened in this diner 3 years ago. Tyler scrolled through the images, stopped on one. A banner being held by a group of service workers. We are all Maggie Sullivan. Can I have this one? Tyler asked. For my room? Mac texted it to him. Watched the boy's face light up. Saw Maggie watching from across the diner. Saw the life they'd saved, the future they'd protected, the reason all of it mattered. At 6 o'clock, the diner filled with familiar faces. This was the 3rd anniversary, the day that had become a memorial and a celebration. The day when everyone who'd been part of the story came back to remember and honor and continue the work. Jennifer arrived with her boyfriend, a teacher she'd met at Tyler's school. Good man, kind man, the kind who saw her value and cherished it. She was happy, really happy, for the first time since her divorce. Sophie closed the diner to regular customers. Tonight was for family, for community, for the people who'd built this movement. Emma arrived from New Haven, her mother and sister with her. The Hartwell women, stronger now, rebuilt after the fire that had consumed their old life. They sat with Sarah and Patricia, 5 women across 2 generations, all of them survivors, all of them proof that courage was contagious. Maria Rodriguez came with her children. the housekeeper who'd been the first victim, who'd taken settlement money and used it to start a small cleaning business, who employed other women and paid them well and treated them with respect, who'd turned her trauma into purpose. Linda Morrison stood at the center of it all, her diner, her family, her life's work transformed into something larger than business, transformed into sanctuary. She called for attention. The room quieted. 70 people, all connected by one morning 3 years ago, all changed by one choice to stand up instead of looking away. 3 years ago today, Linda began, something terrible happened in this diner. A man threw coffee in Maggie Sullivan's face, hurt her, scarred her, tried to destroy her. She paused. Let the memory settle. Let them all remember why they were here. But something else happened that day. 10 people stood up. A community refused to stay silent. Justice prevailed. And a movement began. Linda gestured to Maggie, to the woman who'd become a symbol without choosing to be, who'd survived when it would have been easier to break, who'd kept fighting when giving up would have been understandable. Maggie Sullivan taught us that invisible people become visible when we refuse to look away, that dignity isn't negotiable, that service work is real work deserving of real respect. The room applauded. Maggie stood, walked to the front, 65 years old with scars on her face and strength in her eyes. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd die invisible, forgotten, worthless. Her voice was strong, steady, the voice of someone who'd found herself through fire. But you made me seen. You stood up. You fought for me. You created change that reached far beyond this diner, beyond this city, beyond even this country. She gestured to the room, to all the faces looking back at her. The Service Workers Protection Act passed in 47 states. Assault on service workers is now a felony. Penalties are real. Consequences stick. That's because of you. Because we refuse to stay silent. Maggie looked at Sophie, at the young woman who'd shared her breakfast on a bus and learned what courage cost and decided to pay the price anyway. The Margaret Sullivan Fund has helped 340 families. Tyler's cancer treatment was fully funded. He's healthy, thriving. That's because of you. She looked at Diana, at the nurse who'd stopped running and started healing, who'd climbed into an ambulance and refused to leave, who'd chosen courage over comfort. Women across the country have found their voices, told their stories, demanded dignity. That's because of you. She looked at Sarah, at the lawyer who'd chosen integrity over money, who'd given up everything to do what was right, who'd turned pain into purpose. And Emma, 16 years old, choosing courage, testifying against her father, breaking family loyalty for moral truth. That's because of you. Maggie touched her scars, the permanent record of one man's cruelty, the visible reminder of what she'd survived. I carry these scars every day, see them every morning, feel them when I'm tired, remember them when I'm scared. But they don't define me anymore. They're part of my story, but they're not the whole story. She looked around the room, at her family, her community, her people. The whole story is this: cruelty exists, power gets abused, people get hurt, but kindness exists too. Courage exists. Justice is possible. And ordinary people choosing to stand up can change the world. The applause started slow, then built, became thunder, became a force that shook the walls and announced that invisible people were invisible no more. Sophie stood next, shared updates on the movement. 12 cities with active chapters, 30,000 members, legislation pending in 3 more states. Real measurable change happening because people refused to accept that abuse was normal. Sarah announced a new legal clinic, free representation for service workers facing workplace abuse, funded by donations, staffed by volunteers, making sure money never determined who got justice. Emma, 19 years old and already a voice, talked about campus organizing, about teaching college students that service work deserved respect, that the people who served their food and cleaned their dorms were humans deserving dignity. Diana announced that County Memorial was launching a program, free medical care for service workers injured on the job, funded by the hospital and the Margaret Sullivan Fund, making sure physical wounds got treated regardless of insurance or income. One by one they stood, shared victories, shared setbacks, shared the continuing work of building a world where invisible labor became valued, where cruelty faced consequences, where dignity was non-negotiable. At 8 o'clock, after speeches and food and stories and tears, Maggie found herself alone in booth 7. The crowd had thinned, people heading home, lives to return to, the memorial complete for another year. Tyler sat beside her, 11 years old and healthy and alive against all odds. He leaned against her shoulder, the easy affection of a child who'd never doubted his grandmother's love even when death had seemed certain. "Grandma, did you ever think it would be like this? That one morning would change everything?" Maggie thought about that question. About the Tuesday morning 3 years ago, when she'd poured coffee and been kind and suffered for it. About the moment when her world had ended and somehow, impossibly, begun again. "No," she said honestly. "I thought I'd work until I couldn't anymore. Die invisible. Be forgotten. But you're not forgotten." "No, I'm not. Tyler looked up at her, saw the scars, saw the strength, saw his grandmother who'd worked 3 jobs and saved his life and survived cruelty and changed the world. "You're a hero," he said simply. Maggie smiled, touched his face, the face that had been gray and sick and dying, now pink and healthy and full of life. "I'm a waitress," she said. "I serve coffee and clean tables and make sure people have what they need. That's all I ever wanted to be." "But you did more than that." "Maybe, but I didn't do it alone." 10 strangers stood up. A community refused to stay silent. That's what made the difference. Tyler was quiet for a moment, processing, learning, becoming the man he'd grow into, shaped by this moment and this truth. "When I grow up, I want to be like the angels, like Uncle Mac and Aunt Diana. I want to stand up for people." Maggie hugged him, held him close, felt the steady beat of his heart, the miracle of his survival, the promise of his future. "Then be that," she whispered. "Be someone who sees invisible people and makes them visible. Be someone who stands up when it matters. Be someone who chooses courage." The diner closed at 9. Linda locked the doors. Sophie finished cleaning. Jennifer counted the register. The normal end to an abnormal day. The routine that followed remembrance. Maggie walked out into the parking lot. The same parking lot where a Bentley had once parked across handicapped spaces. Where 10 motorcycles had formed a protective wall. Where justice had begun its slow, grinding work. Diana waited by her bike, 45 years old, at peace for the first time in years. She'd given Maggie a ride home every anniversary, a tradition born from one ambulance ride that had changed both their lives. "Ready?" Diana asked. Ready. They rode through streets Maggie knew by heart, past the apartments where working people lived, past the bus stops where invisible labor waited for transportation, past the quiet proof that cities ran because of people no one noticed until they were gone. Diana pulled up to Maggie's building, cut the engine, sat in the silence that comes after noise, the peace that follows thunder. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Diana said. "That morning, in the diner, the moment before I stood up, I had a choice. Get involved or look away, help or hide. What made you choose to help?" Diana thought about that. About Elena Rodriguez dying on her table 3 years before the coffee was thrown. About the guilt that had driven her away from nursing and onto motorcycles. About the running that had solved nothing. Because I'd looked away before. Let someone die because I respected their autonomy more than I trusted my instincts, and I couldn't do it again. Couldn't watch someone get hurt and stay silent. Couldn't live with another regret. She turned to Maggie. 2 women who'd met as strangers and become family through trauma and healing and the choice to keep fighting. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Diana said. "You reminded me why I became a nurse, why any of it matters. You gave me purpose again." Maggie smiled, touched Diana's hand. 3 years of friendship built on one act of courage, 3 years of proof that standing up changed everyone involved. "Thank you," Maggie said, "for climbing into that ambulance, for staying, for refusing to let me be alone. Thank you for being worth saving." They hugged, brief, tight. The embrace of warriors who'd survived the same battle and emerged on the other side, changed, but unbroken. Maggie walked into her building, took the elevator to her floor, unlocked her apartment. Tyler was spending the night with Jennifer. The place was empty, quiet, just her and the memories and the scars that told her story. She stood in front of the mirror one more time, the same mirror, the same face, the same scars that would never completely fade. But when she looked at herself now, she saw truth. She saw a woman who'd been invisible for 65 years and visible for 3. She saw a grandmother who'd saved a child's life by working 3 jobs and accepting help when pride said to refuse. She saw a survivor who'd stood in a courtroom and told the truth and watched justice prevail. She saw someone who mattered. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they'd become something different. Not marks of shame, badges of survival, proof that cruelty hadn't destroyed her, evidence that she was stronger than the man who tried to break her. Margaret Sullivan, 65 years old, former waitress, current mentor, forever survivor, mother of the movement that changed how America valued invisible labor. She'd been invisible her whole life, but 3 years ago, 10 strangers had seen her, really seen her, had stood up when standing up meant risking comfort, had chosen her dignity over their convenience, had proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, and that had changed everything. The movement continued. The work wasn't finished. There were still battles to fight, still people to protect, still cruelty to confront, still invisible workers waiting to be seen. But tonight, Maggie rested, let herself feel pride, let herself acknowledge that she'd survived, and more than survived. She'd mattered, she'd made a difference, she'd changed the world. Tomorrow she'd wake at 4:30, would ride the same bus, would arrive at the same diner, would train more young women in the dignity of service, would continue the work that one assault had started and one community had sustained. But tonight, she slept, dreamed of Tyler swimming across lakes, dreamed of Jennifer happy and stable, dreamed of 10 motorcycles forming a protective wall, dreamed of justice and healing, and the power of ordinary people choosing courage. And in the morning, when the alarm went off at 4:30, Margaret Sullivan would rise, would face another day with scars that showed and strength that didn't, would continue being exactly who she'd always been, a woman who served others, who worked hard, who loved fiercely, who refused to stay invisible, who mattered, who changed everything.